My name is Adriana Vargo. I'm with Local Food Hub, and because there are a lot of you that are not our typical workshop attendees, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about what Local Food Hub does. We are a nonprofit organization based in Charlottesville, and we partner with small family farms across the state of Virginia to increase community access to local food. So we're basically working with small farms to help them overcome the barriers that are typically there when you're trying to sell into larger markets. We work with about 60 or 70 farms across the state, and we distribute into Northern Virginia, DC, Richmond, all throughout Charlottesville. We have about 250 customers ranging from small mom and pop stores, school cafeterias, institutions, larger distributors. So that's a bit about what we do. One aspect of our organization is education and outreach. So we have a workshop series which consists of 8 to 10 workshops a year on farmer-chosen topics. This year our series is funded in part by the Virginia Beginning Farmer and Rancher Coalition, which is based out at Virginia Tech. It's a great statewide coalition if you're interested in anything farming or ranching. It's a great group to get involved with. They have funding through the USDA and are funding our workshop series, so we're appreciative of that. That's why you have the evaluation along with your packet. So any feedback you can provide us through that evaluation, we'll submit that to the coalition, and it helps us to work on our programming as well. So thank you and welcome, and I'm going to turn things over to Heather Sturtzer from Scottsville Supply Company. She can tell you a little bit about what she's doing, and then she'll introduce our instructor for the evening.
And what she failed to mention is this is also a beekeeper. Yay! All right, so I know quite a few faces in here, but I don't know everybody. So again, I'm Heather Sturtzer, the owner of the Scottsville Supply Company. We are a fairly new store down in Scottsville. We've been open 8 months today, actually. And we're primarily a man-lake dealer of bee supplies, and we kind of round it out with some other direct merchandising. So that's what you can expect when you walk into our shop. So if you open a man-lake catalog, those are the prices that you're going to see. Those are some of the products you're going to see. We have an online retail store as well, so you can always check us out before driving all the way down Route 20 and see what we have going on. Give me a call. Some of our premise as a business is to help support our community and parts of our community, like the local food hub, that have a further reach than we can have as individuals. Okay, so I appreciate the $10 you paid today to support the greater community. All right. We also do a host of workshops and classes down in Scottsville. We put on a series of beginner classes this season, and we're going to be working through a fall management, and a spring management series later this year. Okay. In the back corner, I did bring a few products for sale today that are related to our topic. So if you get inspired or scared, come see me. And we have a couple of DVDs too that are really neat DVDs, and today will be 10% off for your purchases here. All right? Yeah, I'm a beekeeper, so hopefully we're all beekeepers here. Any quick questions for me? No? Great. Okay, I want to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Tignor. He's the state apiarist, and he is by far the expert. He gets into all these dirty, nasty hives, and will fill our brains with good information. So, thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
How many beekeepers do we have here? Heather's finally putting her hand up. Okay, how many of you are been doing it for 10 years or more? 5 years or more? First year. Okay, I'm going to scare the bejeebers out of you. One of the things that I dread talking about to first year beekeepers is diseases and pests in the beehive, because it does give a very scary perspective of what can happen in your hive. But the truth of the matter is that as a first year beekeeper, you're not going to see hardly any of these. In fact, you probably won't see any of these for a few years. So what I want you to take away from this presentation is knowledge of what could happen in the future and ways to prevent that from happening. because bees are an animal. And just like us, they get exposed to lots of different diseases and pests. Same as us. They're subject to colds, to viruses. They're subject to bacterial infections. They're subject to things biting on them. And we've got mosquitoes. We've got roaches in our house and so forth. They have small hive beetles and wax moths in their house as well. So there's a lot of similarities between what they experience as far as the fact that they are animals and get exposed to diseases and pests, as well as ourselves. And just like in your house, just like with your own body's health, if you take proper care of it, monitor it properly, then you should not have an issue in your hives. You want me to use the mic?
Please. Yeah, no effect.
See if the mic is working. I'm going to talk really loud while someone else tries to figure out what's going on with the mic. There we go. It's a connection problem. So, as a beekeeper, as I said, you need to be watching your hives, monitoring your hives for different diseases and pests that can occur that may be detrimental to your bees. And what you need to be thinking about is what we refer to as an integrated pest management approach, IPM. And what this entails is that you need to be monitoring the disease levels, the pest levels, the health of your bees over several times during the year, just to see if they are doing well. And specific pests or specific diseases have thresholds of impact on your bees. As I mentioned, we have bacteria and viruses and so forth in our body. We have things like E. coli in our system, in our digestive system. At a normal level, it's not an issue. But if it goes above a certain level, it becomes an issue for us. It can make us very sick and cause us to need to go to the hospital. Same thing in your beehives. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be tracking inside of the hive what is going on. You know, if you see certain pests or you see certain diseases, how bad is it in there? Some of them, one cell is something that you want to respond to. Others, if you see an adult of a pest, it's not necessarily a problem. But seeing multiple pests, the levels, the numbers of those, that's where we want to be concerned. And so as long as that level of that pest or disease stays in that lower green window here on this graph, that's there, no economic loss. That's where that pest or disease can occur in your hive, and it's not going to hurt your bees. The bees can function properly even with that level. But if it gets up into that red level, that economic injury level, that's a level that could be injurious to your bees. It could possibly cause a loss of your hives. So what you want to do is you want to monitor for that economic threshold, that middle ground. If that pest disease gets into that, what we refer to as an economic threshold, then you need to intervene. You need to do something to bring it down back into the no economic loss level, so your bees can continue to function, still exposed to it, but can function properly even with that disease or that pest there. So what are the diseases? There's lots of them. Again, there's viruses, there's bacteria, there's fungus, there's microsporidia, there's all kinds of different things that can occur in your bees, in your hives. And so what I'm going to cover is some of the common ones that we see in the hive. And by common I mean it's not unusual for me as an inspector to go out and see this in the hives. Again, not necessarily a problem for your hives if I see it, but it is something that we often do see in there. And one of these is the chalk root. The chalk root is a fungus, and what it does is it mummifies the larva. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. The diseases that occur in the beehive, if it ends in brood, that affects your larva or your pupa, the immature stages of the bees. If it doesn't end in brood, it probably is going to be something that affects the adults, the worker bees, the adult worker bees, the queens, the drones. And so this affects your larval stages into the prepupal stages. Basically what this fungus does is it mummifies your larvae. It breaks them down to this hard, chalky-like substance that literally can, if you pick up a frame that's got a lot of them in there, you can shake it and it'll rattle because of the mummies that are in there from the larvae. You'll see lots of them down on the bottom board. You'll see them if it's a really bad infestation. You'll see the mummies being thrown out the front entrance by the bees. You'll see them piled up. That's not a stage that you want to see. 1 or 2 cells, particularly in the springtime, when the bees are in that stress mode. And we consider this as a stress disease, something that is not necessarily a problem throughout the year, something that is not necessarily a problem to the bees. Until they get under stress, they typically don't start to exhibit it. And by that stress, I mean that early in the season where we've got fairly warm days in March and in April, and then cooler nights where the bees are expanding during the day, getting out, moving around. Maybe they don't have as many bees to support the population, and so they're trying to build up. There's a lot of brood production during that year, but the worker population is small. There's a lot of activities that are going on inside the hive. There's a lot of moisture out there because we typically see a lot more rainfall during that time of year. A lot more of a problem as far as the humidity inside of the hive. And so you can imagine what that occurs. Basically, this is a fungus, and so that higher humidity, that those temperatures that allow the fungus to grow, are accentuated during the early season. So what you can do with this, excuse me, so you can go back. So what we can do with this, there's no treatment for it. It's not like fungus on your foot, athlete's foot, that you get. What we want to do is that we want to reduce that stress in the hive. So we want to make sure that apiary is in a good location. So what are some qualities of a good location for a hive? Some of you had that beginner beekeeping class with Heather. I'm sure you guys covered that, right?
Have the sunlight.
Lots of sunlight. You want to have a southeasterly exposure. You know, get good sunlight throughout the day, particularly early in the morning. So it can dry out the hives, it can warm up the hives, the bees can get out and work earlier. What else? Ventilation. We want air circulation through there. So we want to, particularly in the early season, when the mice are coming out of hibernation and looking for a nesting site, we want to keep an entrance reducer in there and keep the mice out. But we don't want to close off the entrance completely. And maybe we can elevate the inner cover or the top of the hive a little bit to let some air circulate through the bottom, through the top, so that we get some exchange of air inside, and also the moisture can be brought down. What else? Oh, and of course, talking about moisture, we don't want it in a low-lying area. We want it higher up on the hill. Because if we sit it down in the bottom, that's where all that moisture, all the cold's going to accumulate. So we want to get it up a little higher, a little elevated on the hillside, not down in a valley or a gully. We don't want it next to a stream. What else? What are we looking for in a good apiary location?
Forage.
Forage? Well, the good thing about being in Virginia, lots of it around. Pretty much we can set up a hive anywhere in Virginia, and as long as we don't overpopulate it, and by overpopulate it I mean stick 100 hives in a 1 acre field. There should be plenty of forage out there for them to get. Even in downtown Richmond, we get good forage because there's plenty of people out there planting flowers in the window boxes and watering them daily, so hives in the cities actually do quite well. So in Virginia, that forage is not so much an issue, particularly early in the season. Right about now, or usually right about now, as we get to those hotter days, those drier days, foraging can be a problem. There's not as much food out there for them. There may be plants out there, but there may not be any nectar in those plants if there's not water there. What else for an apiary location?
Good access.
Access. That's your convenience. Yeah, that is not, that's one thing I cover with the beekeepers every time I talk about good location is access, access, access. It's not just in buying a house, it's in setting up your hives as well. Because you're going to need to get to those hives year round. If there's a problem as far as feeding, there's captured in that hive for an extended period because of rain or because of snow or something, you may need to get out there and get to them. So you need to be able to get there whether it's a dry, nice paved access, or if it's a muddy field or 3 foot of snow. You want to be able to get out there to help your bees. Anything else?
How high off the ground the hive should be?
Well, we don't want it down on the ground. And that gets back to that cold that I was referring to earlier. The cold, or the ground radiates cold. Who's a camper around here? You use a camper pad, right? A bed pad? Underneath your yeah, a hammock, that's good. You don't want to sleep directly on the ground because the ground tends to absorb your heat down into it and radiate cold up. So we want it up above the ground. It only has to be a few inches. 3 inches, 6 inches, to get it off the ground to allow some of that cold radiating from the ground not to affect the bees, but also to get air circulating around it so that you get some of that ventilation we were talking about before.
You can apply your leaves, stalks, and...
Yes. Yeah, and that's one of the things we'll cover later as we talk to the pests is that height can be helpful as far as a pest control. Number 1 on the list is the 2-legged ones. Anything else? We want water. We want good access to water. We want it nearby. Again, we don't want to put the hives right next to the water supply, but we want to have the bees being able to get to that clean or good water source. Not necessarily clean. They actually don't like clean water. They like a little musky or a little muddied water a little bit. Something that's got a little taste to it. But we want it close by, and that could be 1/4 of a mile, 1/8 of a mile, just not right at the stream bed. For no other reason, in case it rains heavy. I think we had some thunderstorms come through last night. Rains heavy, it's going to wash away your hives along with that flooding. So make sure you get it close enough to there that the bees can easily get to it, but not so much it's right on top of it. Yes, sir.
Well, what if it snows and it gets real deep? You have to go and clean around the hive?
If you got an upper entrance, not necessarily. But it is good to, as we were talking about with the access, if you do get enough snow, particularly later in the season where we get into those snowfalls where it's going to melt in a few hours the next day, you want to get out there and clean out that bottom board so that if it's clogged up at that entrance, the bees can get out and fly. Because it may be warm enough for them to fly that next day. We get snows in late February, March, that it could be 6 to 10 inches.
Well, we've had 2 foot or so in it for a couple of hives up.
Yeah, and if it's cold enough that the bees are clustering, they're not going to fly, you shouldn't have too much of a problem. If you've got ventilation up at the top, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But you don't want to leave it there, as you're indicating. You want to leave it like that for an extended period. Again, you want to clean out that bottom board or the entrance down at the bottom there where the snow is building up so that they get that circulation in there. How about wind chill? Anybody think about wind chill? Oh, see, I spent years in Blacksburg. I know that's a hard thing for y'all to take.
I feel sorry for you.
Yeah. Blacksburg is, how many people have been to Blacksburg? Okay. Blacksburg is sitting on a plateau. There's 2 mountains on each side, one on each side of it. And it's facing west to east. And so it funnels the wind right down to Blacksburg, which is at the end of the plateau. So we know wind chill down there. Your bees know wind chill. Okay? So we want to make sure that we're not exposing them to too much cold, and that wind chill can affect them as well. So we want some kind of a windbreak. Could be some, again, if we're putting it up on the hillside, maybe we put it a little bit further down the hill. If we've got some trees behind us or bushes behind us. Worst comes to worst, take a 4x8 sheet of plywood and angle it behind the hive so it'll give you some break in that wind. But don't shut down all the wind. Okay? We want some air, fresh air coming through and circulating through so that they can get that fresh air, we can clean out some of that humidity, some of that moisture. But we don't want that wind blowing them over for one thing, or just dropping the temperature on them. So that's another aspect of it. So doing all of that, we should be on a first step to reducing the stress that some of these stress diseases can cause of our bees. So again, it's not going to be a cure, but hopefully it'll keep suppressing those stress diseases like chalk brood. And so you may see a cell or two of your larvae doing that, but it should clear up rapidly, and the bees have a chance to work their way through it. If they don't, if you continue to see a problem with it, one of the things that we recommend is requeening. What we know from years of experience with chalk brood is that some lines of bees have more resistance to these stress diseases like chalk brood than other lines. And so you may have gotten a queen whose offspring is a little more susceptible to chalk brood. And so just by requeening your hive, that may help to clear up that problem with the chalk brood. Yes?
Is the comb reusable, or do you need to get rid of that?
Normally the bees will clean it out. Like I said, they'll pull out the mummies from the cells. They'll drop them on the bottom board. They'll dump them out of the entrance. But what we want to do is to get them to a state where that population can get healthier, get stronger. And so if you're seeing lots of mummies on the bottom board or out on the entrance, that means you're not getting larvae developing into adults. So that's a problem, like I said, that we want to see about requeening to try to address that.
Left in the comb and stuff isn't
It's going to be there.
Okay.
So it's a naturally occurring fungus, so you're not going to eliminate the exposure of your bees to it. You just want to minimize the stress on the bees so that they can combat that problem. The next disease we'll cover is sac brood. Again, this is a disease of your larva. It is a virus, and again, it occurs early season. It's going to be in that March, April, maybe into the 1st of May occurrence. So the larvae tend to change from that pearly white. If those of you that have looked in your hives, you know that a nice healthy larva it's a C shape at the bottom of the cell that's kind of floating on, well, it's not kind of, it is floating on its food, feeding on that food. And so as the sac brood takes over, the larva, particularly as it gets into the later instars, will start to stretch out, and you'll start seeing some blackening on the end of the tip of the head, and it'll start to become translucent. Over time, it'll literally become a sac of liquid. So it'll be transparent. You'll see the inner organs through the transparent integument, or the skin of the larva. And so as the bee progresses, gets into those later instars, gets capped over, that larva will start to take on these appearances. And so typically it starts to manifest itself throughout its development, but really take hold as far as the larva getting into those later instars, that pre-pupal stage. And when I refer to things like larva and pre-pupa and pupa and so forth, everybody here understands that the honeybee is like a butterfly or a moth. It goes through complete metamorphosis. Starts off as an egg. That egg hatches out, becomes a larva. That larva feeds. It goes through several instars where it gets bigger and bigger, and by instars it sheds its skin so that it can grow to another size. It reaches a critical mass basically, and then it goes into a pre-pupal stage. In that late instar larva stage, the worker bees will cap over the cell, and the larva will enter that pre-pupal stage. It will stretch out. Instead of being a nice pearly white C at the bottom of the cell, it'll stretch out with its head up at the top. It'll go into the pupal stage, in which it transforms into an adult. So over time, over the next week and a half, what it does is it starts taking on those adult characteristics. As a larva, it's basically just a feeding machine. There's a head, there's a rectum, there's something in between, and that's it. There are no legs, no eyes, no antenna. And so as it's developing its adult characteristics in that capped cell, it'll start taking on the segmentation of the body, the head, the thorax, the abdomen. It'll start developing its legs, the segmentation of the legs. It'll start developing the antenna. the head will start developing mandibles and its mouth parts. It'll start developing its eyes, the compound eyes, and the ocelli, the simple eyes. In the abdomen, you'll start seeing things like the reproductive organs, like in the females, the ovaries will start to develop. And so things start to change rapidly inside of that cap cells that makes that transition from that feeding sac of the larva into that worker bee that you crave so much to go out and get that honey or nectar and bring it back and turn it into honey. To make sure that queen is laying eggs and is protecting the hive and building comb and doing all the things the workers do. So that's what that complete metamorphosis in a beehive is. This bee here that you're seeing doesn't make it that far. It gets into the late instar larval stages, and then, like I said, it starts to break down. The virus starts to break it down. Now think of the sac brood as a cold, a very severe cold. What do you do for your cold? You take medicine? Is there any medicine to cure the common cold? No. Okay? Most people, once they get into a stressful situation, the workload is high, or you're cooped up inside the house all winter, or maybe your diet's not as good as it was, or the kids are complaining, or the rent's due, or whatever. Stress starts to build up in your life, and so your body becomes more susceptible to those colds, because the viruses are always there, right? It's just that you don't get the cold until your body doesn't have that resistance to it any longer. And so the sac brood is very much the same way. What we want to do, just like with the chalk brood, is reduce that stress on the hive. Now, some of the things that we can do in addition to making sure it has a good location for the apiary is to feed the hive. If we're feeding the hive sugar syrup, maybe a protein patty, that means the worker bees that are in there don't have to go out and forage for food as much. They're still going to go out. They just don't have to go as far, and they don't have to go out, as many of them have to go out at a time. And so that reduces some of the workload on them. Other things that we can do is we can go into a healthy hive. We can pull out a frame that's got the older cap brood that's in there, those pupa that are just about ready to mature as adults and emerge out. Take a frame or two out of those healthy hives and move those into the hives that show the sickness of sac brood. What that does is it boosts the worker population. Again, reducing that stress. Now, of course, the question is, the frames you take out of that sick hive that's got sac brood, what are you going to do with it? You don't want to put it in a healthy hive, because what that's going to do to the healthy hive. Okay, we just reduced potential population in there, now we're introducing an illness to it. That's not a good idea. So you may want to kind of, as I think you mentioned over here, about what do you do with the frames. My recommendation is, if it's that bad that you can't use it, take it out, cut out the comb, put some foundation in there, wait until the honey flow starts, and then you can reintroduce it. Take out that reservoir of the virus that's in there, and don't reintroduce it into another hive, because you're just going to have more sick hives. So like I said, reduce that stress, add a little bit of brood. Don't know that requeening necessarily is going to help immediately, but it could help in the fact that usually younger queens are a bit more productive than the older queens are. They're going to lay more eggs. And so maybe your population can build up faster. So that might be something, once you introduce the workers, once you reduce the stress, maybe something you will look at in the future is to requeen that hive so that you got a little bit more productive queen that's in there. Okay, the next one is the European foul brood. We do consider this a stress disease, just like we do the chalk brood and the sac brood. But some of you have probably heard the term foul brood before, haven't you? Foul brood is not a good term in beekeeping. It's something that we try to avoid at all costs. Fortunately, European foul brood isn't the bad one. It is bad. It can be a problem. It's just that it's not as persistent in the hive as American foul brood is, which we'll talk about next. But European foul brood is a bacteria that gets into the hives, and in here you can see that here's your pearly white larva over here. It starts to break down the larva in those very early instars. And so it's a disease that actually manifests itself first among the diseases. where the chalk brood will go to the near cap stage, the sac brood will go to the cap stage, American foul brood will go to the cap stage before you really start to see it manifest itself. European foul brood is going to manifest itself in those early late instars of the larva, so it's going to be uncapped brood that you see in. And typically what you see is that pearly white larva is going to start turning brown. You're going to start to see a change in color. It's not going to be pearly white anymore. You're going to start to see a translucence in that curled cell so that you can see the trachea, the white tubes that they breathe through inside of underneath the skin. As it progresses, it breaks down the larva and you'll see kind of a mush there. And of course it'll turn kind of a dark brown mush over time. The main way that we tell the difference between European foul brood and American foul brood in the field is what we call a toothpick test. We'll take a toothpick and we'll stick it in something like this. We'll kind of roll it around a little bit, get it stuck onto that toothpick. If we pull it out and it stays inside the cell, it's American foul brood. Yes, ma'am?
Sometimes when you're in your hive, you just think that it doesn't smell right. Which among these three do you get any sort of cue for how your hive is smelling?
Well, the foul brood is the one that you want to, is the one that really gives you that. The reason it's called foul brood is because it has a foul odor to it. But we don't want to get to the point where we can smell it. If it's one or two cells inside of the hive, for the foul broods, you're not going to smell that odor unless you're really sensitive to odors. If it's a whole frame or half a frame, then you're going to start to pick up those odors. There's actually Maryland has a dog that they've trained to detect American foul brood. You can pick it up from the odors. So it is something that you can smell. It's just that for us, their sensitivity is such that it has to be a lot of cells in there. And if it gets to that point, then it's a problem to the bees. So we want to try to detect it before it gets to that point where we can smell it. We want to get it where it's at one or two cells in there so we can deal with it before it becomes a problem to the bees. But the European foul brood is a bacteria. Again, it affects the young larva that causes death up to about 4 days of age after the egg hatch. Larvae change from a gradual to a yellow color, or gradual to a yellowish brown color. It does form a scale. Sac brood forms a scale. Chalk brood forms the mummies. European and American foul brood form a scale. The difference in the sac brood and the European foul brood scale is that they are easily removed. With the American foul brood scale, it's not easily removed. In fact, the bees can't get it out. But those scales are basically spores that can reinfect the bees. As the workers come out to clean it out, they'll pick it up. As they go over to pick up food, mix the the honey and the pollen together to make the brood food, they'll feed those spores to these other larvae. And of course, that spreads the disease. Yes?
What about this, there's a test you can buy for foul brood?
There are a number of, there's actually a test for American foul brood and European foul brood. There are different tests that you can do. It is something that definitely you can use. Like I said, our initial response is to do that toothpick test. And then if you want to confirm which one it is, or if it actually is, because there's another disease that looks very much like European foul brood. If you want to confirm or get a better handle on whether it is European foul brood, you can run that test. Those are I don't know if Heather carries it, but there are other bee suppliers that do. Dedant and Brushy Mountain and others do. So you can find it on the catalogs and on the internet and so forth if you want to use that. It is something that does have a shelf life to it. So if you buy it, you don't use it for 5 or 6 years, you may want to discard it and buy something new. But typically, if you're on top of things with your hives, it's not something that you need to worry about. Okay, and one of the things that we look at is that the worker bees are not going to be directly affected. It's kind of a secondary effect. If we're losing the larva, the worker population is going to decline. They don't have those replacements coming along. They can't build up as well. But as long as we're keeping that, if we see the disease, it's of 1 or 2 cells, That's not going to affect the population much. So we want to respond when it's getting heavy infestation in there or moderate infestation, that we'll hopefully get it before it becomes a heavy infestation, so that it doesn't affect the worker population. Again, if the bees are there, once that stress is removed or lightened, then typically the bees can work their way through it. And you don't have to do a medication. You don't have to take interaction with them. It's just a matter of monitoring it, making sure that it stays in that below that economic threshold. And then you can keep your bees going the way they are. Yes?
I was told by somebody who runs a store that when some spray my bees were really zesty, they were like chasing people, not even going in the hive, they were chasing people when you're not in the hive, and they told me that it was probably European development.
Well, the question is about the temperament of the bees. Does it change over time? Yes, it does. It is a genetic basis to it. It's an environmental basis to it. And it's internal as well as external. So if there's problems inside of the hive, of course the bees are going to be a little more protective. As that worker population starts to drop, they're going to be a little more protective of it. And they're also probably going to be subjected to robber bees coming in, which is the other concern we have with these diseases, is as that worker population starts to decline, they can't defend the hive as well. Robbers are going to come in because they're looking at free honey. You know, of course, they're picking up the scales, or they're picking up spores of the disease, and they're taking it back with them to the hives. So again, that's something that we want to address as far as a beekeeper, is that we don't want this to spread to other hives. It's not just us that's doing it, it's the bees themselves that can spread it. So the temperament of the hive is something that you definitely want to keep track of. As I said, it could be environmental. Right now, they're probably going to be very protective of their food stores because there's not a whole lot out there that they can feed on. I did notice driving down the highway today, coming down 29 or 28, looked like thistle was in bloom, so there's some food out there for them. It's just not that abundance that we see back in, or we should have seen back in May and in June. Typically, the bees are going to make their honey, that surplus honey, within about 6 to 8 weeks in the springtime. After that, we just hope that they maintain. That there's enough coming in that they can maintain the levels that they have to keep them happy. Because they're, again, just like us. You get hungry, what's your temperament? My daughter calls it being hangry. So she gets hungry. She's not a pleasant person to be around. And she knows when I get hungry, you don't want to be near me. So, you know, keeping track of what's going on outside the hive as well as inside the hive can go a long ways as to making beekeeping for you a lot more pleasant, because it's not pleasant to be chased away from the hive, is it? No. As I mentioned, American foul brood, that's the one that we're the most concerned about. You know, back in the 1920s, there were a lot of state laws that went in for beekeeping, the 1950s and so forth. And those laws were based on this disease, American foul brood. Where the others are a stress disease where the bees can work through it, or if we respond properly to give the bees a chance, they can recover very well. This one, if we get one cell of American foul brood that matures to the point where those scales are formed from the larva and spores are in those scales, it can wipe out an entire yard. And you're trying to keep it in check isn't going to help. So once it starts, that's something you want to address immediately. It is, as I said, it's a bacteria. It actually affects the larva at a very young age. So that larva, if it gets fed a sufficient number of spores in its diet in that first 2.5 days of its life, it will become infected with American foul brood. That bacteria will be growing inside of its body, but it actually doesn't start to break down until after it gets capped over. Right before it gets capped over, you'll start seeing some changes. But typically it's in that cap stage is where that larva, that pupa, is going to start to be broken down by the bacteria. The breakdown is very similar to what we see in the European foul brood. You'll start to see the change in the coloration. It starts turning into that mush, that goo. As I mentioned, the difference we see in the American foul brood versus the European foul brood is that toothpick test. European foul brood, the larva, the mush stays behind in the cell. With the American foul brood, we'll pull that toothpick out and it becomes very stringy or ropey as you pull it out. You can pull it out for a ½ inch to an inch before it breaks from that toothpick. If that happens, you need to get on the phone to me or one of the inspectors in your area. We have aviary inspectors throughout the state that are assigned to specific areas. You want to get on the phone to them to number one, verify it's American foul brood, get their advice as to what to do. But also, we need to be checking to see if other hives in the area, in your yard, have it. If it's just one cell, we can deal with that very easily. But once those cells start to get to that spore stage, this is the vegetative stage that we're looking at. As the larva breaks down further, becomes a scale, those scales contain literally hundreds of millions of spores. It only takes about 5 spores mixed in with the diet of your larva that allows that larva to break down with American foul brood. Now think about that. We've got hundreds of millions of spores in one scale. That means that one scale is enough to infect nearly every hive east of the Mississippi from the Gulf all the way up through Canada and beyond. So what we want to do is to suppress that American foul brood occurring and deal with it immediately as it occurs, because those spores, they are extremely long-lived. Back in the 1950s, I believe, the USDA went out and collected samples of American foul brood. Every now and then they pull it out to see if they're still viable, if they still cause the breakdown of American foul brood in the larva of the bees. To this day, they're still doing it. So the spores of the sac brood, the spores of other diseases that we have, they may last a few weeks, a few months. The spores here last for decades. So when you're buying equipment, used equipment, call us first so we can inspect it and make sure it doesn't have scales in there from the American foul brood. If you forget to do that, as soon as you get home, you take a knife out or a hive tool or whatever, you cut out all of the comb that's in there, bury it, burn it, double bag it, stick it in the trash, but don't use that old comb. Because more than likely, you are going to get, at some point, you're going to get a single cell that has a scale in there. And all of a sudden, all of your hives have American foul brood. So, give you some other indications of what this looks like. With the American foul brood, like I said, it gets to that cap stage. Typically, the larva that's inside, the pupa that's inside, as it's being broken down, a normal, healthy capping is convex over that it sticks up a little bit above the frame, above the comb. It has a nice kind of furry, actually, kind of brownish furry color to it. Those that are infected with American foul brood tend to be concave. They start to sink in. They start to get on a greasy appearance to them. And I don't know if you can see this up here, but you'll start seeing holes in the side of the cell. Now, it's not unusual for you to go into a hive and open it and look through those capped brood, and you'll see one that's got a little hole in it. Take the edge of your hive tool, open it up, make sure there's a pearly white larva on the inside of it. If it is, you're fine. The bees just hadn't finished capping it over. Okay? Put it back in the hive before you leave the yard. More than likely, they're going to have it capped over again. So check out anything that you see, that hole on there, just to make sure that you've got healthy bees, healthy larvae on the inside of there. The other thing is that as the larva breaks down, if they advance far enough into that pupation stage and start taking on some of the characteristics, the physical characteristics of the adult worker bee, one of the things that's first formed is the proboscis, the mouth of the bee. And it's sclerotized. It's a hard shell, just like their outside is sclerotized. Their bones, more or less, are the outside of the body. The tongue is the same way. So if it's a later pupa that is breaking down, that pupal tongue would have started to form. And so when you open up that cap cell that looks like it's got American foul brood underneath of it, if you see something like that, that American foul brood is the only disease that has that characteristic. Now it's rare to see, but when you see it, it's almost a 100% sure diagnosis that you've got American foul brood in your hives. The other thing to look for is those scales. And the scales are going to be formed as the larva gets broken down by the vegetative stage of the bacteria. The bacteria is going to start to form spores. The larva is going to be killed off, it's going to start to dry out, and the spores are going to form a scale on the bottom edges of the cell, of the comb. And so it's going to be at the back, towards the front, on the bottom edge of the cell. So if you look at take your frame, look from the top bar down, angle the bottom out just a little bit, you can see right into the cells. And if you see those scales, like here, 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 this is one that's empty, scales like this, those are things that you want to give us a call. Because that's what the American foul brood scale does, is it forms in those numbers. So think about that. How many hives are we going to be infecting with all of those scales that you see there? So we want to keep the disease down. Now, American foul brood, European foul brood, there are some medications that we can give for them. There's bacteria, and just like us, there's antibiotics that are out there available. One of the ones that's been used for a number of years is terramycin. We recommend that you get a pre-mixed terramycin. Typically, you can see where the terramycin or the antibiotics, you can either mix it into a powdered sugar formulation, or you can put it into a sugar water formulation to feed to the bees. We recommend using the powdered sugar, mainly because the sugar water, depending on the health of the bees, may not be effective. The bees may not get to see it, particularly with this entrance feeder and so forth. You may not have enough bees to feed on it rapidly. It is something that needs to be treated 3 times over a 5 to 7 day period interval. So it's going to take about a 3-week treatment in order to treat the bees with these antibiotics. The powdered sugar, put the powdered sugar around the top bars, outer edges of the brood frames where the disease occurs. And so the worker bees will come up, they'll feed on that sugar, they'll pick up some of the antibiotic in their system, they'll incorporate it into the food that they're feeding to the larva. But the terramycin, lincomycin, and tylosin are the 3 antibiotics that are approved for use on American foul brood. Terramycin is approved for use on European foul brood. Now, there's some question about the availability of these antibiotics in the future. The FDA is going through a change in how antibiotics are being made available to feed animals, which honeybees are. Through the judicious use of antibiotics, they want to cut back on that. So it's going from where you could go to Heather down to Scottsville and pick this up today. In the future, this is going to go from over-the-counter to a veterinarian prescribed medication. And so you will need to get a veterinarian script in order to purchase it and to apply this medication. Tylosin and lincomycin have already gone voluntarily from the over-the-counter to the veterinarian script. So if it's on the shelf now, you can get it. But in the future, as the suppliers run out of it, it may be a little more difficult to get a hold of. So that's a complication, isn't it? How many of your veterinarians know what a bee is? We're trying to work out some of the details to see how we're going to work this out with the bees, but most veterinarians aren't familiar with the diseases in the beehive, and so we're trying to figure out a better way to educate them for one, but also to see if we can act as the diagnostics tool to say, yes, you definitely have American foul brood, you need this antibiotic, and it'll make it a little bit easier to get from the to get this from the veterinarians.
Does it affect, if you put it in your eye, will it affect your honey?
Yes, yeah. Any medication, any treatments, chemical treatments that you put on your hives, all of the honey has to come off. In the case of the antibiotics for the American foul brood, you have to end your treatment a certain period before the nectar flow starts. So 60 days before the nectar flow starts, you should have completed your treatment to allow that antibiotic to clear out of the system and any residue to be lowered to the point where it won't get into the honey that you're going to be eventually eating yourself. Okay, if you've got honey on there, if you've got honey supers on there, you need to take those off before you do any chemical treatment, whether it's a medication or a miticide that we'll talk about later.
If you intend to harvest the honey for human consumption.
Yeah, if it's in the brood frames,
Right.
or if it's a box, let's say it's a box that you leave on there
That will
all the
leave for the
time,
winter.
you're not going to be
Right.
eating it, so forth. As long as that's the case, you're fine. But if it's supers that you intend to be pulling off, or honey that you intend to be pulling off for consumption, human consumption, you definitely want to get those off of the hive before you do use any medication or chemical treatment. Now, I start off with each of the diseases and the pests and so forth, talking about chemical treatments. There are other methods of treating. As I mentioned with the IPM, monitoring, finding out what the economic threshold is, monitoring your hives to make sure that it doesn't extend into it or go above it. The other part of IPM is that there are multiple ways of suppressing that disease or that pest. We look at things like cultural activities, like how often do you requeen your hives? How often do you replace the frames in your hives? We look at mechanical, like some of you may be using screen bottom boards for your varroa mites. That's a mechanical. Some of you may have been selecting genetic strains of bees that show more resistance to some of the diseases, like the American foul brood is a hygienic behavior that is bred into the bees that allows them to have more resistance to American foul brood. And of course we have the chemical treatment, whether it's an antibiotic or it's a pesticide, a miticide, or a insecticide to treat some of the pests that get into our hives. So there's different levels of response. It doesn't necessarily have to be a chemical treatment, but what I typically talk about first is the chemical treatment, and end up with those cultural, mechanical, genetic controls so that you remember those at the end. Because the chemical treatments are more than likely going to have an impact on your bees. Remember, something like an antibiotic or something like a pesticide, those are designed to affect biological systems in a negative way, animals in particular. And what is your bee? It's a biological system, an animal. And so even if it doesn't have a lethal impact on your bees, using some of these chemicals, some of these medications and so forth, it can have a sublethal effect in that it slows down their production. It may slow down the queen's egg laying or stop her egg laying. It may affect their worker bee's longevity. So that yes, she's out there, she's working, but maybe she doesn't live for 30, 32 days. Maybe she lives for 15 or 20 days. It may affect their physical abilities. Maybe that worker bee can't fly 2 miles. Maybe she can only fly a half a mile away. It affects their behavior. And so you want to be very cautious about how you select your response to these diseases and pests. All of them have pluses, all of them have minuses. You know, we think about the cultural. How often do we requeen? Those queens cost money. You know, you got to find the old queen to take her out. You got to stick that new one in. Sometimes they don't accept her. You got to do it 2 or 3 times. So there's cost involved in it. Okay, the mechanical, the screen bottom board. Okay, we've got a potential source of that wind coming in the wintertime and slowing down the development of the bees. And so you want to look at the positive, and also the negative, and figure out which one is best for you as far as your response to these diseases and pests. Now, as far as the alternatives to the medication for the foul brood, number one on the list is suppression. I mentioned to you that there's a specific number of spores that has to be fed to the larva before she starts to break down with the bacteria. The bacteria starts to infect her. Okay? Your goal is to keep the number of spores in the hive below a level where the workers will pick up enough to feed to a larva. Now, the downside of these diseases is that they're all occurring all around them. American foul brood is a naturally occurring bacteria. And so the bees are picking it up on their bodies and bringing it back all the time. And they're being deposited in things like the woodwork, like the frames and the boxes, the bottom board, in the comb where the larvae are. And so your goal as a beekeeper is to keep the numbers of spores down. And so if you can go in and rotate out your equipment on a regular basis, you're taking out a reservoir of those spores and keeping it hopefully below a level at which the bees would be feeding enough to the larvae to have even one of them break down. So we talk to people about replacing and rotating that comb in particular. So about every year you should be taking out anywhere from 2 to 3 frames from each of the boxes that you have, especially the brood boxes, but also the supers as well. And by doing that, every 5 to 7 years, you will have replaced everything in there. And what you're doing is actually what nature has bred into the bees. You know, I get a lot of calls from people that claim that, you know, I've got this beehive in my house, or it's in a tree out in the field. It's been there since my great-grandparents were there. They've been there forever. Well, there have been bees there that long, but it's not the same bees. Typically what happens is that after about 2 to 3 years, your bees, or the bees in that nest, that house, or that tree, or that wherever that cavity is that they are, they're going to swarm. They're going to take off. And they're going to do it the worst time of year. That's 6 to 8 weeks when that food resources are there so they can build up enough to get them through to the next year. And if they swarm at that time, that means that they've lowered the worker population so they can't get out there and gather enough food to make it through the winter. And so the survival rate of a swarm is roughly about 25% from one year to the next. Most of our swarms die. But the survival rate of that hive that's left behind is jeopardized as well. And so usually about every 7 to 10 years, that nest dies out because there's not enough bees to get them through to the next year, or the queen fails because, you know, when that swarm takes off, who's left behind? Her daughters that need to go out and mate and come back and start taking over the hive, right? And then there's birds, and there's other insects, and there's wind, and there's, you know, getting lost on the way back. Not all of them make it back. And so those nests die off. And once they die off, there's no bees to protect it. The wax moth comes in, and they start eating up all the comb. And they tear away all of those reservoir of spores. And the next spring, a swarm comes, finds this nice house to build a nest in, and they start it all over again. And so those people may have had bees in there from year to year to year to year, but there may have been a break in there where things got cleaned out. And basically that's what we're asking you to do with this rotation, is to clean out that comb, that reservoir of spores, whether it's American foul brood or European foul brood or sac brood, and allow your bees a chance to survive a little longer, be a little healthier. Great thing. As those brood combs are used over and over again, the cells start getting smaller because there's a buildup of debris in there. Pupal casings, pollen, all kinds of different stuff. And you know what happens to the bees? They keep getting smaller. And you know who's productive and who's not productive? Big bees are productive, little bees aren't. So you want to have as large a bee as you can in order to be more productive if you're making honey, if you want your bees to be healthy. Okay? Make sure they're the right size. So rotating out those brood combs will allow those bees to be a little healthier over time. The other thing, as I mentioned before, the resistant lines, the hygienic bees, the BSH bees that were developed out of Baton Rouge are super hygienic. Those are bees that can detect those capped cells where the bacteria is breaking down the larva, and they can get in there and pull them out and toss them out of the hive before they become spores. When they're in that vegetative stage and breaking down the larva, before they become a problem, a persistent problem inside of the hive. We can do things like sanitation. So if you have a hive that's got lots of frames in there, they have lots of cells, medication isn't going to work. So what we typically tell the beekeeper is that maybe we can save the bees, but the woodwork and the comb has got to go. And so we can take that and we can take it and put it into it used to have a chamber that we could sanitize. We would treat it with a chemical to kill off the spores or deactivate the spores, if you will. And so we could reuse it. We no longer have that chamber. There's some states that are trying to maintain it, but there's fewer and fewer. Gamma radiation, something that people are looking at. So you can take that equipment and you can treat it. Not with the bees in it, but you can reuse that equipment. Elimination. Okay, if we want to save the bees, what we do is we'll shake them out, keep them in a cage so that they can let those spores run through their system. And then after it's done that, we can shake them out onto new comb or new foundation with new frames, or at least old frames with new foundations, so that any spores that are left behind, they're buried into that wax. But the old contaminated equipment, particularly the frames, we're going to burn them. In fact, in the commercial system, most commercial beekeepers, if they see American foul brood in their hives, they automatically assume that American foul brood is going to be resistant to any medication that they do. And so what they typically do was just put a match to that hive and burn everything.
Bees too?
Bees too.
The box.
Because the bees are, as I said, they're susceptible to the American foul brood. And so keeping the bees just means that you're just perpetuating that genetic strain of bees that are going to likely break down with American foul brood. So they'll sacrifice the bees along with the woodwork, along with the comb, along with the boxes, everything that goes with it. And so that's a cost of business. But if they're doing the proper suppression of the disease, it limits the number of hives that they can do. And just to let you know, American foul brood, while we're extremely concerned about it, while this is the reason for the state laws, why this is something that can persist for decades in your hives, it's not often seen. We see it in about 1% of the inspections that we do. So it's not something that we commonly see. Most of the time we're seeing, we can see sac brood early in the season, we can see the chalk brood early in the season. Not something that we're concerned about. The bees typically work their way through it. But about 1% of the yards, the apiaries that we go into, we'll see the American foul brood or signs of American foul brood. And so we'll have to deal with that one hive or those 2 or 3 hives in that yard. Yes?
Is there a particular pattern? I mean, we're using IDD, like marked on like a map from where it occurs. Pattern
where it occurs?
Yeah.
There's not if it occurs and it becomes to the point where the beekeeper has not responded to it and becomes a problem, like I said, other bees from the area will come in and start robbing it out, and so they'll take it back to them. So we don't want it to get to that point. So right now we don't have a hotbed of American foul brood, if you will. We'll see some in the valley, or we'll see some over in the Virginia Beach area. We'll see one up in the northern neck. As long as that's 1 or 2 hives, we're good. But back in I guess it was back in maybe the 70s, there was an outbreak of American foul brood in Nelson County, and it just went rampant. And what they tell me is right before I came on as a state apiarist in 2000, it was about the time they stopped seeing, yearly cases of American foul brood in Nelson County. So as long as we're on top of it, as long as we get to it early, we won't see that this is where American foulbrood is occurring, because in that case, what it is it had gotten into the feral population, and so where we could deal with it with the managed ones, the feral population that were in the trees and the forests were breaking down with it on a regular basis, and then our managed bees were going out and bringing the spores back. So our feral population is down a little bit. Actually, it's down a lot from the 1970s. And our managed beekeepers are a little more aware of American foulbrood and taking steps like rotating and so forth that keeps suppressing it better. So again, where it is something we're very concerned about, and if you call us and say, can you come out and look at my bees? We're going to say, well, you know, we're kind of busy. If it's just you want me to see if you're managing right or if the queen's in there, I can direct you to a beekeeper nearby. But if you call us up and you say, it's got this funky smell and I just can't tell, this, you know, I see this kind of ropey stuff in here, we're going to be on your doorstep that afternoon. So, you know, again, you know, I tell people it's not what you know, it's who you know. In our case, it's not what you know, it's what you say. So, what I'm trying to do today is just make you aware of the diseases and how to recognize them, so that you know what to do and who to call, our office and so forth. Yes, ma'am.
So, close to my hives, and many of you probably have the same thing, I have the ground bees, the Andrina is the genus that I have that's in the hillside that's near my hives. Do you have any sense of the interaction between those, the feral bees and the honeybees, and whether there are pests or diseases that are actually being
Yep. Many of these same
exchanged?
diseases, chalk brood, the sac brood, some of the pests like the small hive beetle occur in those native pollinators as well. The bumblebees, the solitary wild bees that we have. We see very similar diseases in there. The difference, though, is that the Apis mellifera, or the honeybee, is an insect that lives from year to, or the colony anyway. He lives from year to year to year to year. You have a queen that can live up to 7 years, and so that colony can persist for 7 years, and then her offspring can keep it going for years and years after that. So the honeybee is one that things can build up inside the colony. The solitary bees and the other social bees, like the bumblebees and so forth, that's an annual nest. And so that problem that they had is gone the next year, because that nest is gone. They've got a new nest, or their offspring have got a new nest. They'll overwinter as a single reproductive, they'll found it. Or in the case of the minor bees or the adrenals and so forth, those digger bees and so forth, right. They'll lay their, the mason bee. They'll dig a tube through woodwork or in the ground and so forth. They'll provision the cells with enough food and lay an egg. Okay, that nest isn't used the next year. They'll create a new nest. The next reproductive cycle will use a different nest for that. So you don't see that persistence of the disease, or the buildup of the diseases in their nest. That's the main reason why we don't see or don't hear about it as much in the others. But yes, they definitely do have it. Yes, sir.
Do we have issues with bees coming from, package bees coming from southeast areas?
Well, in the case of the American foulbrood, actually, if you look at the bee law, the Virginia bee law, there's a difference between bringing packages in, or queens in cages, and bringing bees in on equipment, on the comb. If you're bringing the packages in, you're bringing a queen in a cage, you have to make sure it's been inspected by the state of origin, that they came from healthy bees. But you don't need to tell me that you're bringing them in. You don't need any permission from my office to bring them in. If you're bringing bees on comb into the state, you need to contact us, provide us with those inspection reports or health certificate, and then we can issue an entry permit for you. And that's because these spores that we're talking about with the American foulbrood and European foulbrood and so forth, we don't see them on the workers, or if we do see them on the workers, it'll be embedded into the comb as they're building it out from that foundation. Or it'll be a very minimal number, so it's not an issue. But the comb being brought in could have those scales on it.
What
And
about
so-
commercial bees coming through?
Commercial bees need the same thing. If they're coming into the state on comb, they have to have an entry permit from us in order to bring them into the state. And what we request is like I said, an inspection report or a health certificate from the state of origin. It said they've looked at it, they're apparently disease-free. Now, that doesn't mean that, they've looked at all the hives. It doesn't mean that they're completely free of disease. It just means that when they looked at it, it was disease-free. Now, the other provision in our law is that once you come into the state, you're subject to inspection. And so we require, or we ask for a location where those bees are going to be placed so that we can follow up if there's a need for that. So if another state calls up and say, hey, you issued a permit for so-and-so, he has some bees down here, we've done an inspection, we've found such and such disease, you might want to follow up on it, we can do that. Yes, sir?
What's the downside of using the resistant ponds and
Well,
cages?
they're bred for it. It's not going to be like a GMO where they're introducing the genes. The genes are there. We're just breeding the old style breeding like we had with animal husbandry, of selecting bees that are that have these traits like the hygienic behavior. It's selecting for those queens that express more of it, and drones breeding, we're raising more drones from those queens and so forth so that we can introduce it into it. The downside is that many of these traits are recessive. And so within 1 or 2 generations, it could be totally lost. And so maintaining that resistance can be an issue if you're raising your queens yourself. You need to be selecting for, you need to be testing for that genetic trait and selecting that line to raise your queens from or to produce your drones from. Okay. Now, I mentioned there's one other disease out there that kind of looks like European foul brood, kind of looks like sac brood. It's kind of a mystery to us. This is the idiopathic brood disease syndrome. That's the scientist's term for it. The beekeeper's term for it is snotty brood. I really prefer snotty brood. It's very descriptive, and it really gives you an image of what this stuff looks like, doesn't it? I mean, think about it, snotty brood. You can see it in your mind right now, can't you? You just want to reach for that handkerchief. Oh, you forgot to bring the handkerchief, didn't you? Who's got a handkerchief? I'm doing a survey. How many people have a handkerchief? Good for you. You know, that used to be a common thing. It used to be a sign of I guess, a less vestige of being a gentleman, is to have a handkerchief when your wife or your daughter or significant other or whatever gets upset and starts to cry. You can whip out that handkerchief and they can, dab their eyes and so forth, blow their nose, whatever. That's not happening anymore, is it? Okay? We still have snot. So the handkerchief still needs. And later on, I'm going to tell you a reason why you want to have that handkerchief with you. It's for that IPM. Okay? If it's not for the significant other, it's for your bees, your significant others. But snotty brood, like I said, idiopathic brood disease syndrome, cruddy brood, snotty brood, whatever you want to call it. Actually, do you know what idiopathic means? Anybody know what idiopathic means? You know what idiopathic means, don't you?
Don't remember.
Don't remember. You know what idiopathic means, don't you? Exactly. You do know what idiopathic is. You don't know what the cause is. You have no idea where it came from. You don't know what to do about it. That's idiopathic. Okay, translation for a scientist. Don't ask me, because I'm not going to tell you. Idiopathic brood disease syndrome, snotty brood. What we're seeing is very similar symptoms to that breakdown, that goo type breakdown that we see with the European foul brood, we eventually see with the sac brood and so forth. The problem is we don't see that ropiness. The problem is we're not seeing the bacteria in there. So we don't know exactly what's causing it. We just know the bees are being stressed out and they tend to be having a problem. the main issue is that there are a lot more things affecting our bees than when I started in beekeeping. I started in beekeeping in the 1980s, the pre-mite, the PM stage, where the only thing we worried about was American foulbrood. Okay, now we worry about lots of other things. There's lots of other stressors on our bees. We see varroa mites, we see, in the past tracheomites. We've got new insects that are coming in, like the small hive beetle. We've got people building houses next door. Anybody that came down with the Seminole Highway or road there, I cannot believe all the building that's going along there. What's that little road going over? Yeah, I mean, the highway just all of a sudden split, and I'm thinking, okay, which way do I go? There's no sign. So I said, okay, I'm going down. But lots of new stressors on there. They're losing habitat. They're losing food resources. Whether you believe in global change or climate change or global warming or just this is a normal cycle, we've had the hottest June on record. Last year we had the hottest summer on record. That was preceded by the coldest winter on record. So those environmental issues are impacting your bees. So lots of stresses on them. And so what we think is that this is related to that stress disease. Now there are other things you're going to see in there. You're going to see ball brood and so forth. Those are things that are going to come up. But these are, like I said, as far as those stress diseases, the sac brood, the chalk brood, the European, the snotty brood, if we're addressing the overall health of the bees, they should have enough immune health or immunity in their system in order to overcome those diseases, in order to fight them off, in order to be productive with those things going on around them. So monitor your bees on a regular basis. Now, that doesn't mean you go in every day. It doesn't mean you go in every week. I know you're going to want to, particularly you first-year beekeepers. But typically what you want to do is you want to check them on a quarterly basis, every 3 to 4 months. Okay? Go through the hive, look at the brood frames, see how the bees are doing, see the health of the larva, the pupa, and so forth. Okay? In the interim, watch that the bees are flying in and out. Pop the lid just to look in. It takes all of 2 seconds. You don't want to tear the whole hive apart, but just look in to make sure you got bees in there. The fact that you got bees flying in and out of the entrance doesn't necessarily mean that your bees from that hive. It could be the hive next door that's coming over and robbing. So just look in, make sure the bees are up the top and they're healthy and so forth. Lift up the back of it. Okay? See if you got a little weight to it. Okay? If you got robber bees going in there, it's not going to have much weight. Okay? The other thing, if they're eating up the food on the inside because they have no food outside, no nectar going on, and they're eating up all the reserves, you're going to find that by the weight of the hives. A lot of people nowadays are picking up these scales to put under the hives to monitor the weights of the hives, and you can actually see the ups and the downs and so forth of when nectar flows are occurring in your area. Actually, it's fascinating. If you ever look at some of the plots of it, you can actually see when the bees are flying. Because overnight, they all come back to the hive, and so the weight tends to go up. And then as they start flying, it drops down dramatically. And you say, okay, that's when they flew. And he emptied it out, looking for food. So monitor those hives. Just don't disturb them too much because, again, that two-legged pest is the #1 pest of your hives. And it's usually the guy that's wearing the white suit and got the smoker in hand. Because I don't know how you feel, but if my phone keeps ringing as I'm driving down the road, no, I didn't say that. You can delete that. My phone keeps ringing, emails keep dinging, people keep walking into my office and so forth, and I know I've got to get this report out, or I've got to get this presentation prepared or whatever. It puts a lot of stress on them. And your bees are the same way. The more you bother them, the more stressed out they're going to be. Nosema is there's actually 2 nosema diseases that we're aware of in the United States in our honeybees. That's the Nosema apis and Nosema cerana. Both of these are microsporidias. Initially, in the old literature, you're going to see them referred to as a protozoa. Recently, they said, no, it's a subgroup of the protozoa. It's actually a microsporidium. Well, really, what a microsporidia is kind of a cross with a fungus. So it's something that gets into the gut. The Nosema apis, at least, is a spore that gets into the gut of the bee, and it starts to get into the cells of the gut lining, and it starts to grow in the gut lining. And so over time, what happens is that Nosema that's growing in the gut lining prevents the bee from literally passing food from its gut into the body cavity. Its nutritional level drops. Okay, it is a spore former. Because it stops that food digestion, while the ingestion is going on, we see symptoms of like dysentery at the front of the hive, droppings of feces on the frames and so forth, things that should have occurred outside of the hive, like on your windshield. So what we're looking for with the Nosema apis in particular is that dysentery as a sign of it. Now, there are other reasons for dysentery. It could be poor food. Poor quality food will cause that dysentery too. But typically, the Nosema apis we'll see in the wintertime, particularly late winter, when the bees are being stressed out, they're confined inside the hive, they can't get out to defecate. They have a rectum that is designed to expand so they can hold it in a long time. And so they'll do periodic cleansing flights in order to wait out those cold periods where they can't get out and fly around. But once they do get out, hopefully they should be defecating outside of the hive instead of inside the hive. If we start seeing it around the hive entrance, inside of the hive, that's where concern starts to grow. The other beast, the Nosema serrana, acts the same way as far as it's feeding basically on the bee, but it passes over that gut lining. So we'll see it in the head, we'll see it in the thorax, we'll see it in the abdomen, in the cavity of it, not just in the gut. Typically don't see that dysentery associated with it. But what we do see is that weakening of the bee, same as we see with the Nosema apis, where the adult worker bee doesn't fly as well, doesn't live as long, isn't as productive, and so forth. And so we look at that lifespan aspect of it. Is it starting to die off faster? And that's a concern for us. We're seeing a lot of winter losses throughout the United States, Canada, around the world, averaging 30%. One of the potential causes for this, and one of the things that we associate with things like colony collapse disorder, is that Nosema serrana causing problems for the bees. Now there is a treatment for it, Fumagillin B, which Heather allowed me to show to you. This is an antibiotic. Don't ask me why, but this is not subject to the FDA determination about the judicious use of antibiotics. This one is not going through that over-the-counter versus the veterinarian. It's still staying over-the-counter. Again, don't ask me why. But this is fed to the bees in a sugar syrup solution, typically as a prophylactic treatment for Nosema apis. Beekeepers would treat it in the fall. It's 2 1-gallon treatments in the fall in order to suppress the Nosema apis. Seems to have control over the Nosema serrana as well. We just don't know what the efficacy of it, how effective it is against that Nosema serrana. So if you do see signs of Nosema serrana, one of the ways that we detect Nosema serrana is that we'll ask beekeepers to send us bees. It's actually a bee lab run by the USDA up in Beltsville. You can send bees, you can send combs up there of what you think of diseased bees or diseased hives. And they'll analyze it for things like the varroa mite and the Nosema, American foul brood, and so forth, and send you back a report. What they're looking for with the Nosema is those spores. And so they'll take out about 10 bees and they'll crush them up. They'll look at the content, the fluid content of it to see if there are any spores in there, and give you a reading back or a determination back of how many spores per bee that they saw. That treatment threshold for Nosema is 1 million spores per bee. In recent years, recent months, we've seen samples come back with anywhere from 150 to 250 spores per bee. So it is something that we are on the lookout for and advising beekeepers to do. One of the other things that we're looking for the local associations to do is it's a real simple test. You take 10 bees, you put 1 milliliter per bee into a baggie, you crush them up, you take a drop of that, you put it under a light microscope up to 400 powers, and you look to see those spores. Any high school student can do the same thing. So it's something that local beekeepers could do as a service to other beekeepers as well. Local groups could do that for them. You don't necessarily have to send it off to me or send it off to the USDA in order to be analyzed. There are also a number of viruses that affect the adults. The cashmere bee virus, the chronic paralysis virus, clouded wing. We see the acute paralysis, the Israeli acute paralysis virus, deformed wing virus. One of the ones that we see very common are those deformed wing virus and the black queen cell virus. That seems to be, we're doing a national survey where we're taking samples of bees and trying to find out what's in our beehives. And one of the things that keeps popping up is that black queen cell virus. In fact, it's so common they've stopped testing for it now because they just assume it's out there. The thing is, we don't see it. Most beekeepers never see black queen cell virus, which goes back to that common cold thing. Okay? It's there. It's just not expressing itself because the bees are keeping it suppressed by their health. The bees are healthy enough, these viruses won't take hold. So again, once it gets stressed out, once the population starts to decline, the food supply is not as good, maybe the apiary isn't the best in the world, whatever, you keep opening up that hive way too many times. They get stressed out, and we start seeing some of the things like chronic bee paralysis or acute bee paralysis. So the deformed wing virus, unfortunately, is something that we know that pests of the bee, specifically the varroa mite, will pass on to the bees. So that's a cue to us when we start seeing deformed wing virus. Maybe your varroa mite levels are a little too high. And so we'll take samples and look for that, get the varroa mite count to see if we can control the varroa mite and in that way control that deformed wings virus as well. But some of the symptoms are uncontrollable tremors, inability to fly. We'll see what we call a K-wing. Typically the bees keep their wings back over their abdomen. With the K-wing, what it is that viruses weaken them, and so they can't use those muscles, and so typically the front and hind wing come unhinged and you start seeing them separated out off to the side. You may see occasionally 1 or 2 bees in your hive doing that. It's when a lot of bees start doing it, that's when we start to be concerned. Because maybe that bee just flew back from the field and she's weak. She just needs a little bit more food. But if it's a lot of bees that are in there that you're seeing, and by a lot of bees that see a couple hundred, a couple thousand, that's something that we're concerned about. We start seeing a hairless, greasy appearance. And also we look for things like crawlers. Again, that inability to move or fly. Instead of flying, what they'll do is they'll crawl out the entrance, they'll be on the ground out in front of the entrance or around the hive instead of flying away. So those are some of the things you want to be looking for when we start looking for viruses. Now, we're going to shift gears here a little bit, go into the pest of the bee. But you guys have been sitting there a long time, and I'm sure some of you want to stretch. So we're going to take a little bit of a break. I think a question came up during the break about crawling bees. Remember I mentioned to you about that with the nosema and the viruses in particular. You will see. I'm sorry. I just don't like to use this. You will see bees crawling around the sides of the hive and so forth, around the entrance. That's a normal thing, particularly on hot days, where they're going to come out from that hot hive and try to cool off a little bit. What we're talking about with those crawlers is not necessarily, are they on the box itself, on the outside of the box? Are they on the ground 3 or 4 feet away from the hive? And they just don't look like they want to take flight. That's what we're talking about as far as those crawler bees. Okay? All right. Pests and predators. There's lots of them. We're going to start with the vertebrate pest. In this case, I mean, you can see there's a number of them, four-legged for the main part, but as I said, you are the biggest pest of your bees. Lots of people around your area that are going to be interested in your bees and not really happy sometimes with your bees. They may be doing things nearby that they have no idea that they could affect your bees. Question again during the break dealt with pesticides. How does that affect the bees? And of course, someone applying pesticides, if it's an insecticide in particular, can have a detrimental effect on the bees. So we work with the applicators, the farmers, the mosquito control, and the pesticide applicators in order to educate them as well as the beekeepers about how to minimize the impact of pesticides. And one of those, of course, is that the later in the day that you're applying that pesticide, the less impact it's going to have on the bees. Because your bees are out looking for food. And most of the insecticides that are out there are contact pesticides. So if it comes in contact with their body, it can have detrimental effect. So what we want to do is to prevent them from coming in contact with them. Well, as the day progresses, as it gets hotter and so forth, many of those flowers start to close up or dry up as far as a nectar source. And so your bees may be flying out looking for water, they may be scouting around and so forth, but most of that nectar gathering occurs in the morning time, particularly in the summer, when that nectar is most available. And so if we do it, people are educated to use pesticides later in the day or in the evening when bees are in the hive, less chance of having contact with those bees for many of those pesticides. And so that minimizes the impact that they can have. As I said, a number of vertebrate pests that are out there. At one time, I think most people felt that the mouse was the biggest problem. There's actually 2 times a year that the mice can be a problem for your bees, going into winter and coming out of winter. What the mice are looking for is a place for protection, a shelter. And your hives provide a very nice, warm shelter from the weather, from the wind, snow, all kinds of different things out there, as well as predators. And so your hives are very appealing to mice. And so as they're going into winter looking for that place to hibernate, they can get into there. Now your bees at the same time, in the wintertime, they're going to be clustering together. They're going to be trying to maintain contact with honey, which is up above. And so they generally tend to move up, and they also tend to be close together, which opens spaces up inside of your hive that is not protected by the bees. And so the mice can find a place to nest where the bees aren't going to know they're there or bother the mice at all. The second time, of course, after that winter hibernation is they come out of the holes and other things out in the fields. They're looking for a place to nest to have their offspring. And again, your beehives are an excellent location. And again, your bees are way up here. The mice are coming in the entrance down at the bottom. They can be nesting in those bottom boxes where the bees aren't. And so typically what we see is the nesting occurs inside. You see 3, 4, 5 frames that are chewed away. The comb is chewed away. The mice bring in nesting material, grass and so forth to fill up that hole. They'll chew on the woodwork and so forth. So you've lost comb, you've lost the frame may be too weak to support the bees and the honey and so forth. They may bring in some diseases and whatnot. And so those are things that we want to avoid. So we want to keep the mice out of your hive as much as possible. Skunks, opossums, raccoons will come up to your hives at night and they'll kind of scratch at the openings. The worker bees will come out to protect it, and they scoop up the adult bees to feed on. Now it weakens the hive in that you're going to lose workers, but it also, as we were talking before about the temperament, those bees are now going to be on a state of defense, a state of alert. And so what they're going to be doing is getting in there, and you come in the next day and you want to work your hives, and all of a sudden you can't understand why your bees are just so unreasonable. Here you are trying to help them out, and they're just all over you, trying to sting you and pester you and so forth. And basically what they're doing is they're responding to what happened the night before. So by keeping preventing vertebrates from getting into your hives and bothering them during the night is going to be better for you and also your neighbors. Because it's probably not going to stop just right there at the hive. They're going to be on alert for other things that are going around. Their zone of protection is going to be enlarged as a result of that activity during the night, that bothering during the night. Some of the things to look for, scat in the yard. You're going to see scratches on the entrances, or there may be some holes in your hives, or on the bottom board and so forth, on the back, and you'll see some scratching around there. You'll see bare grounds or depressions in front of the hive or around those openings where the skunk or the possum is kind of laid down to get away from the bees, because they're very vulnerable on their bellies. Lots of fur on the backs, but that protects them from those stings, but bellies may be a little more vulnerable. And so they'll try to protect themselves by kind of pressing down on the ground to keep that protected. And so you'll see kind of a bearing of the ground in front. I actually have a skunk and the possum and the raccoon and everything. Those wildlife cameras are amazing things if you want to see what goes on in your yards. I've got videos of a skunk this past winter that came in pretty much every night to the hives. In the past few years, I've had a problem with my bees. At one of our research sites, it's been very protective every time I go there. And there really wasn't any reason, because I was using the same bees at another site, and they were quite easy to work with and so forth. And I'm thinking, they're not hungry. And then I start seeing the scat and so forth, and the scratches and the depression. I said, okay, yeah, it's a skunk. So I got a game camera this past winter and put it out there. Snowfall, rainfall, didn't matter. Those things were out there just scratching. One of the things we talk about with the skunks and so forth is to put some chicken wire across the entrance of it. and I've got a video of this skunk that came up to the hive and encountered that chicken wire, walked around to the side of the hive, and then reached over the chicken wire to get into the bees. And you could see them flying out, coming out to try to protect it. So it is something that is a very big concern for your bees, but also for your safety, your neighbors, and your children, and your pets. Because again, the bees aren't discriminatory as far as what they're going to protect themselves against. If they have a disturbance and they're on alert, they're going to try to protect themselves. And they know only one way to do that, and that's through stinging. Okay, so some of the things that we can have as far as the mouse, that hive entrance, I believe there's some metal entrances that you can get that you can kind of move around. It's got holes in it and so forth. What that does is reduces that entrance to the point where the mouse can't fit through, but your bees can. And so they can come in and out. So in the wintertime, we do recommend if you use the wooden one. Typically there's a little 4 or 5 inch opening there that's half the depth of the stick, if you will, for the entrance. What we recommend is you make sure the opening is up above, because over the winter you can have some debris fall down from the hives, and so it could clog up that entrance if the opening is down below. By having it up, it gives them a little bit more room. The bees can come in and out without that entrance being stopped. I mentioned the chicken wire with the skunk, carpet tacks, pitfall traps. There's a animal control down in Emporia that told me that he's got a little 6-inch tube that he uses with a bait. Skunk can walk in but can't get out easily. And as long as they can't lift their tail, there's no problem as far as you being subjected to their defenses. And so you can go in and close it up and haul it off to some place and then release it somewhere else. So there's different traps that you can use for it. Pitfall traps, I try to discourage people from doing that because you do have to get that skunk out at some point. Bears, a lot of people are very concerned about bears now because we are encroaching on the bears' territory. We've had bears that have come into downtown Richmond in recent years. We had one a few weeks ago. They went into through the shopping center in Short Pump. They are out there, and they don't know the difference between your backyard and the forest. They're following the streams, they're following the rivers, because that's where the food is. And unfortunately, we're building our houses along the streams and the rivers and so forth because we like to see the water out there. We like to go out and fish, and we like to boat, and we like to just sit out on the deck and watch the birds fly by. But we are building their homes and our businesses and our roads where these animals are. And so as you're setting up your beehives there, they're seeing potential food. Now with the bears, everybody knows the stories about Winnie the Pooh, right? Why does Winnie the Pooh go into the hive? To get the honey. To get the honey, right?
It's the larvae.
It's the larvae. They're going for the protein. They're going for the bees. Okay? So bears are not Winnie the Pooh. When they get into it, they're not going to just stick their head in the hole and lap up the honey. They're going to take their paws and break open your hive and start ripping apart the frames and comb and everything else to get to the larva, to get to the bees, because that's what they want to feed on. Will they feed on the honey? Sure, it's there. Carbohydrate source, they're like that as well, but primarily they're going for that protein source. And they will destroy an entire apiary. Once they find a yard or once they find a hive, they'll keep coming back to that location until that food source is depleted, which means you either lose all your bees or you move them. So the best thing I can recommend for bear prevention or about bears is prevention. If you think you have a good source of bears visitation, if you've had reports of bears in your area in the past, put up an electric fence. Okay? If they can't get to that hive, they're not going to find a food source, they're not going to come back. They also do not like open. So don't put your bees on the edge of the forest or the edge of the field and where it's shaded and so forth. Put it out in the open where the bears are less likely to travel. The other thing is to elevate your hives. Mentioned about it with other things as well, but with the skunks and the possums and the bears, if you can elevate it above where they can reach, then you've eliminated that food source to them. Up in the upper plains and the Minnesota and so forth, they'll actually build 8-10-foot platforms with a hole in the middle they can haul things up through to place their bees up there so the bears can't get up into them. I don't know if you want to do that or not. It's seems a little cumbersome to me, but elevating the hives is a possibility. We actually installed a hive on Capitol Square this past spring. And so we've got it elevated about 3 stories up. I don't think I'm going to have any problems with the bears. The other thing that you need to worry about, as I mentioned, is humans. Okay, yes, you're the number 1, but all those other humans are number 2 on the list. What we want to do is to provide protection to your bees, but also provide protection of others from your bees. In other words, we want to make sure that as they're walking down the street or along, your neighbor's out and they're just kind of walking along the property line, your bees don't fly into them and accidentally sting them. The neighbor's dogs and so forth don't create a racket or their cows come over and start scratching their backsides on the boxes and start disturbing them and so forth. So one of the things that we recommend, of course, is that we have hedges or privacy fences around it. It should be about 6 foot tall. Most of your bees, when they come out of the hive, they're going to come out at entrance level. But they don't forage it at that height. They typically want to get up to 10, 12 foot up in the air, maybe even a little higher, in order to scan the environment to look for that food, for that water source. And so they want to get up into the air to look for it. So they're flying over most people's heads. It's only when they see that food source that they're down on the ground and people encounter them. And typically, at that point, they're going to be more afraid of whoever that person is or their dog or whatever than that person or dog is of them. And so they're going to take off flying away. So it's that initial flight that we want to make sure they get up above people's heads, above your neighbors and so forth. So make sure it's at least 6 foot high. Yes, ma'am.
What's the law, the responsibility? I live in the city, I have a hive right outside my house. I had my first service worker to the property since I've had a hive. And it dawned on
Well,
protect myself and my.
yeah, how to protect yourself against the liability and so forth. Actually, Virginia just passed a limited liability for beekeepers law, or put it into the beekeeping law. So there is a limited liability, and as of yesterday, I think we have everything in place that it can take effect. Part of the requirement was that we have best management practices for beekeepers. The Board of Agriculture met yesterday and passed those. I understand they passed the best management practices. So once they've been posted and so forth, they take effect. So very soon you'll have that limited liability if you're following the best management practices. Now, someone coming on your property, the best thing, of course, is that is what you've already done, is to educate them, let them know it's there, offer them protection if they want it, if they need it. And you have that protection, you have the veil, you have probably the gloves and so forth. So making sure that they're well protected is one of the things that you want to do. And again, those best management practices are there. It's for the beekeepers, but it's not necessarily, it's there for the protection of the public. So the things that are in there are things that would minimize the chance of encounters of the bees with other people. So in your case, with the people in the backyard, you've had them there doing work, of course. Like I said, just doing whatever you can do on your own property to minimize that interaction with the bees and the people.
But I shouldn't need to change my homeowner's insurance, or have special policy or anything necessarily. It sounds like the state's taking care of that for me.
Well, again, it's a limited liability, and so there's limitations on how much it does. If you're doing something that is that would cause the bees to be more defensive and so forth, if you're negligent, gross negligent, so forth, those are things that would negate that limited liability. There are insurance companies that do offer liability insurance for beekeepers, so that is something that you might want to look into. The other thing is location. Again, if you're in downtown Richmond and you want to set up some beehives, your exposure or people being able to know that your beehives are there are probably a little more likely than somebody that's setting up in Tazewell County in the mountains of Southwest Virginia, where there's less people that can come in contact or view your bees. So that is something that you want to consider as location, and also education. Make sure that the people around you, that your friends and relatives and so forth are aware of what you're doing for the benefit of our environment. Our bees are out there, they're going out and they're pollinating our agricultural crops, which is a benefit for us as far as our food production, but they're generalist pollinators. They don't go to just agricultural crops. They go to anything and everything that's in bloom that offers them food, that nectar, that pollen. And so they're going to our trees, they're going to our brambles, they're going to our wildflowers, they're going to our forests, they're going to our meadows, they're going to our wetlands. They're providing us with a stable environment, and they're also offering us something else, money. Because all that beauty that we see, that we enjoy as citizens of Virginia, we pull in people from all over the world to come see the Skyline Drive and their pastures and their valleys and so forth to enjoy our environment. And they bring money with them and they spend it here. And so there's a lot of benefits we get from the bees. We want to educate people as to the benefits of those bees, but also the fact that, as I mentioned before, those bees that are out there are probably more scared of you than you are of them. And so if the bee is out there foraging for food, she's got to, in her mind, I need to go to this flower to get this nectar. Okay? You're not a flower. You're not a source of nectar. And so why would they go to you? I mean, they may be flying around, you may see them, but typically they're not going to be coming on you, landing on you, and if they do, the chances of being stung are pretty minimal. So as a beneficial insect, it can be quite a thrill to work with. But educating the public is part of having those bees and making sure they understand why you're doing it and the benefit that others get from it. Yes, ma'am.
That bee might think you're a bear.
Well, that's at the hive. Now, remember, I'm talking about away from the hive. If you're at the hive, they're gonna have more reason to be defensive, aren't they? Because mom's there, and sisters are there, and the babies are there, and the food's there. And so, one of the reasons why we don't want to be opening our hives and disturbing the bees too often is the fact that they're going to be protective of their food supply, of mom and the babies. And so that's, like I said, if they're out foraging for food, foraging for water and so forth, the chances of encountering with animals is minimal. But at the nest, they're going to be much more protective of home, just like we are. I mean, if somebody came and started knocking on your front door, busted open the front door, ran in and started emptying out your refrigerator, you'd be a little alarmed, wouldn't you? And so that's what the bees are doing. They're trying to protect their home. Yes?
You mentioned that it's not the best place to put a hive at the edge of the yard where there are trees in a forest.
Yeah.
Well, I had a deer tear apart my hive. I mean, totally decimated the thing. But I thought they'll never come back again, so I replaced it. So now I'm wondering, I want to move it now, but now, how do I move it now?
You said the bear came in and damaged your hive. When was that?
This past winter.
This past winter? More than likely he or she has moved on. They have a huge range that they go out to.
I'm thinking
at this point,
before he comes back.
Right. Once you want to protect it from when they're coming back. Hopefully they have forgotten about that because of the other food sources and so forth out there. So an electric fence around it should be a good protection against it.
I think I need to move it because it's at a friend's home. It's not.
Well, yeah, and then electric fences are not something that you want to set up at somebody else's and hope they're going to know it's there.
So
yes.
I'd like to move it, but what's my best shot at moving it at this point in time?
Well, the great thing about honeybees is especially, do you have the Langstroth hive?
I'm sorry?
Do you have the Langstroth hive design? Okay. The Langstroth hive is actually designed to be moved. Some of the others not so much, like the long boxes and so forth. It takes a little more effort to move them up. But there's typically is one or a few entrances in there. You close them up. You make sure it doesn't fall apart. You stick them on the back of the truck, or I've seen other people that have put it in the back of their van, and you drive it away and you pull it out. Typically you're going to do this at night when all the bees are back in the hive. You close it out. Now we're in warm temperatures now. So you may have to use a little smoke to chase them back into the entrances because they're more than likely going to be on the outside trying to cool off, or wait until a cooler night in the fall, and you can do that. But close up the entrance, and by closing it up, I don't mean put concrete or block it off and so forth. Some screening across the front of it. There are some moving screens that you can get at some of the suppliers. But basically, you're just looking at window screen that you can put across the entrance, stuff into the entrance so it's bee tight. The bees can't get out, but the air can get in. Cloth towel or burlap cloth and so forth to stuff in that entrance. There's some staples you can hold the boxes together for the Langstroth style, but typically I tell people just get a strap around it just to hold together, make sure it doesn't fall apart on you if it tips over, and then just lift it up, put it on the back of a truck or a trailer, or worst comes to worst, in the back of the van. Yes, I have done that. I have your veil handy. If you're moving a short distance, that's not an issue at all. But I mean, if you think about these commercial beekeepers, they're doing the same thing. They're loading up hundreds of hives on the back of a semi and transporting them hundreds of miles, some of them across country, from Florida to California. And so transporting bees is something that is one of the main benefits of using these new hive boxes, these Langstroth style or some of the others that are designed to be moved. Yes?
What are carpet tacks?
Carpet tacks are, if you're putting down carpet, typically around the edges, they'll put down these strips of wood that have tacks that are sticking out at the end. It holds the carpet in place, so they'll nail it down into the floor and then roll the carpet over top of it, and it holds it in place. So you can go by the hardware store and so forth and buy those. Anything that as they're reaching up onto the entrance or kind of trying to scratch at the entrance that would poke their paws will discourage them from continuing to do that. You can lay it down in front of the hive, do the same thing, so that if they're laying down to get away from those stings, it'll irritate them as well. So you want to make it as uncomfortable as possible to get those bees from your hives. Okay, any other questions?
How high is the bear fence? How high is the bear fence?
The bear fence, well, if you're using it, it's doubling as the skunk, possum, and so forth. It's not just as high, it's also low. So you want to think about how the distance between the strands. Typically these are strands of wire that's going up the fence, 3.5, 4 foot high. That's all
It's
you need.
really not that high.
No, it's not that
Almost
high.
like a picket fence around it.
Correct. Yeah, it's just a
It's
normal
just a
fence that's going around. It's just that these are strands that have electricity going through them. They typically have a solar panel to it to keep the battery charged, so that it has charge on it throughout the day and night. So, and the good thing is it has a little switch on it. You can turn it off so you can get to your hives without getting the jolt yourself.
When's the best time to get the honey out?
Honey out? When there's honey in there? You can take honey out at any time. So if you want to take, if you've got surplus honey in there, by surplus I mean what the amount that the bees don't need to get through the summer, at least, which would be about 20 pounds, one super. But you want to, I recommend that you keep on there what they need to get through the winter, which is 60 pounds. So you're looking at a deep or 2 supers. So anything above that, you can take off at any time. After the flow, over the winter, if you're going to extract it, you want to do it, extract it someplace warm. Moving on to invertebrate pests. Those are our mites and our beetles and our moths and so forth. These are becoming more and more of an issue. Since 1980, we've had, or the early 80s, I should say, 1982. We've had an influx of invertebrates pests into the United States that our bees haven't been exposed to in the past. So we basically had our bees isolated from the world since the 1920s. And then sometime in the 70s, 80s, we started seeing the introduction of some of these pests from Asia, from South America, South Africa, also coming up through South America, that have been causing problems for our bees. Number 1 on the list is one that's been here for, I guess, forever. I referred to it earlier, it's the wax moth. And there's actually 2 wax moths. There's a greater wax moth and a lesser wax moth. Basically, it's a bigger larva and a smaller larva, moth and so forth. What they're doing is they're getting in and chewing on the residue left behind by your pupating brood. So that left behind pupal casings, the pollen and so forth that's left in the wax of the brood comb is what they're feeding on, the larvae do. Typically they'll get into the midrib and they'll burrow through the wax, creating channels and so forth. And the wax moth tends to leave behind cocoons as the larva feeds through. And you can see the results of that cocoon in this picture here. So that webbing that's left behind tends to fill up and make the wax or the comb unusable by the bees. And at one time, like I said, this was the #1 pest of beekeepers. It caused tens, hundreds of millions of dollars to commercial as well as the hobbyists and sideline beekeepers of stored equipment. Okay, and you mentioned it's stored equipment. If your bees are strong enough to monitor the frames, you've got bees walking on all the comb, wax moths should not be a problem. Okay? So the first thing on the list of what to do is make sure your bees are healthy and your colonies, your hives are populated well with bees so that they're working through all the comb, patrolling it to monitor for this pest as well as others. But the other problem that we see with the wax moth is that pupation stage, they go through that complete metamorphosis as well. So when they go into the pupation stage, they tend to burrow into the wood and then fill a cocoon around them. And that burrowing can weaken the frames, the woodwork of your hives. It's not going to do so much to the 3/4 inch thick boxes and bottom boards and so forth that you have. But those frames are pretty thin wood. And so it doesn't take much to weaken it to the point where it won't sustain, it won't hold that honey or the comb with the brood in it. And so where the losses were is that the beekeepers were losing the comb to the wax moth, but also the frames and so forth. Cleaning up and whatnot would cost them money because it would take time that they could use for other things. And so, like I said, at one time, this was the #1 pest of beekeepers. Treatment for it, chemical, we have a para-moth or para-dichlorobenzene, PDB. These are moth crystals. Now, some of you are familiar with moth balls, right? Okay, that's naphthalene. The para-dichlorobenzene does not get absorbed or should not get absorbed into the wax. Naphthalene will get absorbed into the wax. So if you want to treat your stored equipment, again, no bees, stored equipment with para-dichlorobenzene, make sure that it's not naphthalene you picked up by mistake. Because where PDB, you can take the PDB off, you can air out the comb, you can put it back onto the hives after sufficient airing, several days. The naphthalene, you take it off, you air it out, you put it on the hives, it kills the bees. Because the odors or the fumes are still in that comb because it's in the wax now. Crystals, what you're going to do is stack that stored equipment after you extract them or after you remove them from the brood comb from the hive. Stack them up, put a couple of tablespoons of the crystals on a paper towel or a wax towel. There are actually boards now that you can get to treat it. Seal it up. It is a fumigant, so you want to have it if you're going to use it, it should be during the summer or during a time period where the crystals will volatilize and those fumes will fill that cavity or that space of the stacked hives that you've got. Kills off the larvae, kills off the adults. Does not kill off the eggs. Okay, so you want to have on there for several weeks in order for any larvae or any eggs that are in there to hatch out and kill off the larvae. Once it's completed, you can pull them off. Like I said, you can air them out. You can double bag it, keep it from being reinfested. But many people just keep it in storage throughout the period and wait till it gets cold, because the easiest way to kill the wax moth, egg, larva, and adult is freezing temperatures. So you can either wait for winter, or you can take those boxes. If you don't want to treat with PDB, you can put them in the freezer, let them freeze solid. If you're using comb honey or producing comb honey, you want to take those frames of comb honey, put them in the freezer, let them freeze solid. It may take several days to do that, okay? Because as you put them in there, if you put a whole box in there, the outside edges are going to freeze fairly rapidly, the inside is going to take a while. So you want to make sure it's all frozen throughout to kill off the larva, the adult, but also the eggs. Because if you cut your comb and you box it up and all of a sudden those eggs hatch, now you've got a problem. Light repellency, this is a moth. They don't like light, so you can stack them up, stack up your used equipment get a sufficient amount of light or sufficient amount of sunlight to chase the moths out during the day. There are some fumigations that you can use. One of those is carbon dioxide. Basically, the easiest would be to double bag your equipment, stick a hose in there and get some CO2 and fill it up with it, seal it up, let it kill off, again, the adult and the larva. If you do multiple treatments, it should get the larvae that hatch out from the eggs later that take them down. You will see in the literature, and you will see some beekeepers talking about using BT. There is no product that's labeled for use on the wax moth in hive equipment regarding BT. Okay? There has been in the past. So if somebody tells you to use it, somebody tells you, oh, this will work, tell them, let me see the label. What we tell people is the label is the law. If you're not following the label, you're breaking the law. You know what happens to people that break the law? Fined, jailed, seizure of equipment, all kinds of good stuff. Okay? So whatever chemical or pesticide you use, follow the label. Okay? If it says you can use it the way it says it is. It should be for that pest. If it's not listed for that pest, don't use it. Okay, trichomite. I'm going to be very brief on here because we can't find trichomites. But I mentioned that in 1982 we had the introduction of some exotic pests. This was it. Showed up on our doorstep, went throughout the United States. We started getting problems as far as survival of the bees, particularly in the wintertime. Our winter survival went down to pretty much nothing. And it was a direct result of this. It was getting into the bees, particularly in the wintertime during that cluster. Jumped from bee to bee to bee, and the population was not really all that great, it wasn't growing, and they started to overpopulate. We don't think there's a problem with it because we can't find it out there anymore. One of the reasons we can't find it out there is because of the varroa mite. Beekeepers and researchers and everybody else concentrated so much on the varroa mite, they ignored the tracheomite. What we think is that one of two things happen. The bees just naturally develop resistance to the tracheomite, which is possible, or the fact that the tracheomite takes about 5-6 years to really get it to the point in a colony where it can cause the loss of the hive. Okay, varroa mite takes 2 to 3 years. Okay, so if you've got a pest in there that is persistent and is killing off your hives every 3-4 years, and the other pest takes 5-7 years to do it, we may not be seeing the tracheomites because the varroa mites are killing them off with the bees. So let's hope it's the resistance end of it, okay? All right, what can we do? Menthol, ignore it. We don't have tracheomites. We can use grease patties, ignore it. We don't have tracheomites, okay? Especially do not use grease patties because the grease patty promotes small hive beetles. It's a place for them to feed and grow without being pestered by the bees, and so it can be a problem. So do not use grease patties. Okay? If you think you have tracheomites, send me a sample. I'll dice and slice them, and I'll look at it, and I'll see if you've got tracheomites. Send them up to the USDA Beltsville Bee Lab. They'll slice and dice, and they'll look for tracheomites. But more than likely, we'll give you back a negative report. Okay, varroa mite, I mentioned those before. Those were the next exotic pests that came into the United States. This came through in the late 80s. It hit Virginia about 92. It started causing real problems for it. In fact, when we got the tracheomites, we had some researchers, USDA and other researchers and so forth, beekeepers, went over to Europe where they had problems with the tracheomite before we did. And we were asking, okay, what do you do? How do you handle this? What should we be doing? And they looked at us and laughed and said tracheomites? Wait till you get varroa mites. Then you got a problem. Don't worry about the tracheomites. Varroa mites have been a problem for over 20 years now. We think this is the main problem our bees are having because they are so prevalent and virulent as far as the damage they do with the bees. I mentioned before about the deformed wing virus that carries a disease. They feed directly on the developing pupa of the bee, so it causes the bee to be weakened. It causes physiological changes in it. Bees that are being raised in the fall are what we call winter bees. Those are bees that have higher fat content, live longer, and so forth. The ones that are raised in the spring have less fat content. They're more vibrant, they're more active, and so forth. And so they don't live as long. The problem is, what we're finding is that the bees that are being fed on in the fall, the pupa that are being fed on in the fall by the varroa mite, they come out as spring bees. And so they don't live as long. And so one of the problems I've been seeing in our hives for several years now is that, that pre-mite, back when I got started, we'd have 10, 12 frames of bees going into the winter. And we come out with 8, 9 frames of bees. Now we go in with 10, 12 frames of bees, we're lucky to come out with 2 or 3 frames of bees. That's a huge dent in the population, that cluster that's trying to survive those late winter February temperatures that get down to freezing and below. Puts a huge amount of stress on them. And they lose contact with the honey that's in the hive, and so they can literally starve to death when there's 60 pounds of honey on them because they can't reach it. There's not enough bees there to reach it because they're committed to stay on the brood. Once the queen starts laying eggs in January, that cluster is going to stay right where those eggs, larvae, and pupa are. They're not going to move off of it because if that temperature on that eggs, larvae, and pupa gets below, significantly below 92 degrees, it's going to die. And the result is the colony dies. And so the bees are committed to keeping that brood at 92, 93 degrees at the expense of losing contact with the honey. And in many cases, as we've seen in recent years, at the expense of survival of the colony during that wintertime. What happens is the varroa mite, the female, will seek out larvae that's just about ready to be capped over. She'll go into that cell, she'll get down into the brood food, workers will come in, they'll cap it over, she'll come out, she'll take a little feed on the pupa, and then she'll lay some eggs on the side of the wall. The first brood that hatches out is typically the males. She'll go down, she'll feed on the pupa again, she'll come up and she'll start laying some more. Then the females come out. She'll go down and she'll feed some more and she'll lay some more eggs. Meanwhile, her offspring are maturing and they're feeding on the developing pupa. And they're maturing and then the males and the females mate. And hopefully that developing larva or pupa of the worker gets to the point where she emerges from the cell, she'll chew her way out. And when she chews her way out, she brings along with her 2, 3 varroa mites already mated and ready to start laying eggs again. And they'll look out and start finding cells that are ready to be capped over and start populating those and start increasing that population of mites. Typically a problem in the summer and the fall, we recommend that people sample for varroa mites as you come out of winter and as you are getting ready to go into winter, particularly those bees that are raising the winter bees. So right about now, you should be sampling your hives for varroa mites. Now, first year beekeepers should not be a problem the first year. Second year, third year, that's when you want to be concerned, you want to be monitoring that because that mite population in that package that you've got probably wasn't so big that it was a problem that they could raise up to the point where they're injurious to the bees. But come the second year, come the third year, that population is going to be at the point where it's going to be injurious to the bees and affect their survival over the winter in particular.
Question about that sampling, so in the summer and the fall, so if we should be looking now. Now is when it's usually recommended that you not be messing about in your hive because you're going to open it up, you could encourage robbing, you could make a mess in your bee yard from that perspective. So how exactly do you approach that, going in and getting enough of a sample of bees to be able to assess your varroa population without causing the other issue?
Well, you don't necessarily need to go into the hive and tear it completely apart and spend a lot of time in there. Okay. One of the sampling methods that we have is called a sticky board.
Right.
You've got a screen bottom board, some people have that, others you can get a board and put a screen over top of it, slide it on the solid bottom board. Basically, you're going to leave that sticky board on the bottom board for 3 days. You pull it out, you count the mites that you see, you divide by the number of days that it was in there, and you get your mites per day drop. The other sampling that we can have is we have a alcohol wash or a sugar shake, things like that, where we're going to the brood frame, we're taking about 150 to 300 bees out, closing it back up, seal the bees into a jar that's got a screen top to it. If you're using the alcohol wash, what you'll do is you'll have the solid mason jar support top. Put some alcohol in there. And about 150 bees, we're looking at to 300. We're looking at a quarter to a half a cup of bees. And putting those into a jar, quart jar. If you use the alcohol wash, you put again, half a cup to a cup of alcohol in there. You can use some detergent with a gallon of water with a tablespoon of detergent, or people been looking to use the washer fluid from your cars to use that as well. Basically, you're going to shake it up. You're going to pour the bees out through a screen onto that. Remember that white handkerchief I talked to you about? This is where it comes in. Pour it out over that screen onto a white handkerchief. Take the bees, put them back in there, do it a second time, pour them out through the screen onto that white handkerchief, do it a third time, and then you look at that handkerchief. The raw mites are nice brown, reddish color, oval shape. They're real easy to pick out, especially on a white handkerchief. And so you can count the number of mites there. Okay? The problem with that method is that if you picked up the queen when you started doing that, not a good thing, is it? So we've come up with a different method with the sugar shake. Again, you're going to go in, get the brood, put it into a jar, that 150 to 300 bees. You're going to use that screen top now. Take a tablespoon of powdered sugar, put it down in there, roll it for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then shake out all the sugar through the screen onto that white handkerchief. Another tablespoon, roll it 3 to 5 minutes, shake them out. Another third time, so forth. And then take some water, sprinkle over that white handkerchief. It'll wash the sugar away, and you can start seeing the mites on it. The bees are still alive, still functioning. Go over to the hive. Yeah, they're going to be high on sugar. You open up the jar, you dump them back into the hive. Their hive mates are going to love them. If you got the queen, she's going to just go right back in and start doing her thing. So what you want to do in that case is count the mites on your, whether it's a white cloth or a tan cloth, something that you can see the mites on, that the water or the alcohol or the whatever can wash through. Okay, count the number of mites, figure out how many bees you have. Okay, if I had a half a cup of bees, I got 300 bees. I see I've got 10 mites, or let's say I've got 9 mites that I counted. You want to figure out the number of mites per 100 bee. Who's the mathematician here? 300 bees, 9 mites, 3 mites per 100. Okay? A few years ago, I was going around telling people 5 to 7 mites per 100 bee is your threshold. Okay? The raw mites seem to be getting a little more virulent, and so that recommendation for the most part is being lowered. So now we're looking at 3 to 4 mites per 100 bees at this time of year. If you see that number, you want to take action. Okay? The sticky board, when you count those numbers, okay? We're dividing by the number of days. If you're seeing 30 to 40 mites per day, you want to take action. Okay? Before it was 60. Now it's down to that 40 level. Okay? Per day. So if you leave it in 3 days, you see you can count 120 mites, you got that 40 level, right? Okay? So those are the samplings that we do. You also see things like the cappy scratcher to pull out the drones. The raw mites like drone cells better than they like the workers. And so usually the population of the mites is a little higher in the drones, which makes sense, right? Because the drones take longer to develop. So they can get another cycle of eggs in there, more offspring off of those drones. But people were taking the capping scratchers and kind of in those late instar or late pupal stages, going into the surface of it and teasing it out so they could pull out the pupa in there and then looking for the mites on there. There's no threshold level for that. All that is an indicator I've got mites. So it'll let you know you got mites, but I can tell you everybody in this room has got mites. Okay? Pretty much everybody in the world has got mites of some kind or another. Yes, ma'am.
When you bring the bottom board, the sticky board in the bottom, would that interfere with ventilation?
No. You're only leaving it in there for a few days. Okay? So ventilation, you're still getting that ventilation through the entrance. You're still getting it, you should have an upper raise or something in order to let air flow through. So yes, you're cutting down on the level of ventilation, but not totally shutting off the ventilation. And it's only 3 days. Okay? If you're worried, do it for 2 days. Just do it more than 1 day. Because just putting it in there could disturb the bees and increase that mite drop. So leave it in there for more than 1 day. pull it out, however many days you left it in there, divide the number of mites you saw by that to give you your mites per day.
Quick question.
Yes?
I had thought I read an article someplace that Russian bees were immune to these varroa mites. Is that true?
We're going to get to that. Talking about treatments, how to bring down, once you know what that threshold level is, if it's exceeded the threshold or getting near the threshold, how do we bring them down? Again, there are chemicals out there, synthetic as well as organic, that are available for everybody to use if they use it properly. HopGuard, Apivar, those are some of the organic. Apivar is the formic acid, excuse me, not formic acid. Apivar is the amitraz. It's not organic. Apistan is a fluvalinide base. Checkmite is a coumaphos base. Apolife Var, Apiguard, we've got the thymol, which is organic. We've got the Mitoway quick strips of formic acid issue. There's lots of choices out there. Okay, these are all chemicals. These are all pesticides. Yes, they're all miticides because that's the classification of pesticide they are, but they are still a pesticide. Okay, they're designed to kill invertebrates, and your bees are an invertebrate. Okay, so even if they don't, it's designed not to kill them, it still could have an impact on them. Some of the things we're seeing, of course, is that, like I said, especially with the checkmite, you put checkmite in the hive, it shuts down queen egg laying. Okay? The other thing is, you want to look at not just what is it doing to the mites or what is it doing to the bees, what is it doing to you? So, something like Apistan up there, which is a fluvalinate, has a very low toxicity for us. The coumaphos in checkmite is highly toxic to us. So that's something you want to make sure you're wearing gloves with. Things like some of the fumigants that we use, formic acid and so forth, the oxalic acid that's new that's out there. You're using it as a fumigant. Okay, those are things that you want to make sure you're not breathing in. So make sure you have that respiratory protection as well. Make sure you have eye protection so that it doesn't burn your eyes. Yes?
Why is the first one in parentheses?
First one is parentheses because I put this together a couple of years ago, and so it was just approved this past year. Some of these this is not an all-inclusive list. Some of them are brand new. Like I said, the amitraz base is brand new. The HopGuard is brand new this past year. Oxalic acid, just this past winter. Yes?
Have you tried struggling with colloidal silver?
I have not. So there's a lot of experimentation going on among beekeepers. Unfortunately, they get out there and they tell other beekeepers, this works. Remember what I said about the law and the label? Make sure that you're using something, that whatever pest you've got, make sure you're using what is labeled to use for that pest. And every label has got a list on it. Okay? There are lots of home remedies and so forth out there that may work. But the question is, what else is it doing besides killing the mites? Okay? In the case of these, as we mentioned before, if you're using any chemical in your hive, your honey supers have to come off. And there may be a time period that you can't put supers on even after you take these treatments off. So read that label, know what you can use it for, how you can use it, when you can use it. Oxalic acid is one that you can't use unless there's little or no brood. What's going on in your hives right now? It's July. You got frames of brood in there, right? Guess what you can't use? Oxalic acid. Okay, alternatives. The first one is my duh response. I was telling beekeepers for years, and then I think the USDA researchers came out several years after I kept telling people, requeen, just requeen, that's all you need to do. I said, yeah, here's something new, you can just requeen. The varroa brood is tied to the bee brood. If the bee's brood is not there, the varroa mites can't reproduce, right? So if we cage the queen or requeen the hive, that's going to break the brood, isn't it? that's going to break a production of brood by the varroa mite. If you're using something like the screen bottom board, where all those mites that 80% of them would have been on the capped cells are now out on the bees, are more likely to fall off the bees, and maybe that screen bottom board you're using is a little more effective. Maybe if you put sugar on them to coat the bees to encourage the mites to fall, will be a little more effective. And so just by re-queening or occasion the queen, you might have an impact on the bees. A drone trap, putting comb in there that's got that's drone comb, as I mentioned before, the mites prefer the drones. Put it in there, let the queen lay drone eggs in there, all those unfertilized eggs. Once it gets capped over, you've got trapped mites. Pull it out, stick it in the freezer, let it freeze solid. Oh, darn, you lost all those drones. But you don't care about drones, right? The workers are the ones that do all the work. The workers are the ones that bring in all the food. The workers are the ones that raise the babies. The workers are the ones that protect the hive and make the comb and so forth. What do the drones do?
They fertilize the big queens.
Not your queen.
Not mine, but somebody else's.
Yeah, so they're no good to you at all. So, pull out that frame. Oh, I'm sorry. You thinking I'm talking about us? Pull out that frame of capped drones, put it in the freezer, freeze it solid, pull it out, thaw it out a little bit, stick it back into the hive. You know what your bees are going to do? They're going to clean it out for you. Queen's going to start laying eggs in there. You're going to have another crop of drones in there, capped over, pull it out, stick it in the freezer. It'll help you maybe not eliminate the population, but at least keep it in check. The one caution I will give you, don't forget you put the drone comb in the hive. Otherwise, you're going to be not breeding drones, you're going to be breeding varroa mites. Okay? So don't leave it in the hive. Don't let those caps, pupa, emerge as adults. Powdered sugar, something that a lot of beekeepers have tried in the past. If it's used right, if it's used often enough, it can be effective. Okay? What the principle is that you're dusting the bees, you're coating them with sugar. The mites can't hold on to the bees as well, and they fall off. Again, with the screen bottom board, it works well. But you have to get enough sugar on the bees. You have to coat them enough that you've got ghost bees flying out. Okay? And you can't do it one time. Remember, 80% of the mites are under those capped cells. So you need to do it once, come back in 5 to 7 days, do it again. Come back in 5 to 7 days, do it again. Sifter or just shake it onto them.
Do you do it on every level?
You want to do the brood comb. So if you use a duster or whatever, you want to get all the bees coated with them, because the phoretic mites are going to be on potentially all the bees. So yes, you want to coat all the bees, every level. But you want to do it 3-4 times, and then after that, every 5 to 7 day interval, and then after that about once a month. Okay? Resistant lines that we talked about for the others before. The Russian bees have shown resistance to the varroa mite as well as the trachea mite. The VSH bees have shown resistance. The super hygienic bee has shown resistance to the varroa mite. The Minnesota hygienic, they're breeding some of that super hygienic into them. There's a number of others. Purdue ankle biters are out there. All kinds of different ones are out there. Do a little research, find out which ones. There's pros and cons to each of those lines. Okay? The Russian bees don't build up as fast in the springtime. They don't go in with as many bees in the wintertime. And so there's a little adjustment if you're used to Italian bees. A little adjustment you have to make for those Russian bees. So know what you're looking at when you start looking at these resistant lines, what to expect and how to manage them, because some of the management is a little different with each one. Screen bottom board, we mentioned before, again, as the mites fall off the bees, they fall down to the ground. Okay? The higher the elevation, the less likely they are to get back onto them. The more encouragement we can give them to fall off, the more effective that screen bottom board is going to be. Small hive beetle. And we'll see if we can end with this one. Small hive beetle is basically our new pest on the block. As far as the bees are concerned, this came in 1998, 1999, 2000, we don't know. Right around 2000, they started showing up in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Which state they came into first, we don't know. What we do know is they came from South Africa. Small hive beetle is a persistent, but minor pest in South Africa. In North America, it is a persistent and can be a major pest if left unchecked. Very similar to the wax moth, the adults move in, they lay their eggs in the cracks and the crevices, the eggs hatch out, the larvae feed on the honey and the pollen and the brood of the bees. As they move across, they lay down a little slime that look very similar in appearance to the lesser wax moth larva. But that slime, that ooze that comes out of them is very odorous and builds up over time. And as that odor builds up, it chases the bees out, so they abscond looking for a better place to live. As the larvae are unchecked now, that odor keeps building up, it drives the adult beetles out. And so now we've got frames that in boxes and woodwork and so forth that the bees won't go on, the beetles won't go on, no insect is going to go on. The larvae, as they mature, exit the hive and burrow into the ground to pupate. And so that pupation outside the hive is that weak link. That's where they're the most susceptible and the most controlled. But the main thing that we want to do is to make sure that the adult beetles that can get into your hives, even if they lay, and so you could have the feeding going on outside of there. Same thing in the honey house. You bring your supers in, don't wait 4 or 5 weeks to extract them. You won't have any honey that you can use because all that ooh and goo that the beetles do, they also defecate as they crack open the cells of the honey and defecate in the honey. It causes it to ferment and so forth. You won't have any usable honey. So make sure that you extract in a timely manner. Don't leave cappings laying around that the beetles can get into and multiply on. And I don't recommend that you take a pile of it and throw it out in the yard and let the bees clean it up, the cappings, because the beetles can get underneath of it. And they can start, the larvae can be going on underneath of it out of sight of you and the bees. Freezing works the same as the wax moth. It'll kill off the small hive beetle, all stages of it. You do want to freeze it a little longer. They're a little more resilient to freezing temperatures. So it takes a little bit colder, a little bit longer. Typically, it's more the dehydration aspect of that freezing that kills them off than the actual cold temperatures. There are traps that you can use. Heather's got one on her back there, on a table in the back there. There's lots of different traps that are available. You can see one frame trap here. You can see the others. She's got one that's a frame there. I don't recommend those frame traps. It's a real good way to know that you've got small hive beetles. But pretty much everybody in Virginia's got small hive beetles in their hives, even if you brought packages in, because they come in those clusters. So I don't recommend using those. You use an oil trap in there. The bees, more or less, it's just a happenstance. They fall through and they get into that oil and they drown inside of it. What I do recommend is the bottom board traps, the West and the Freeman. It covers the entire bottom board, so as the larvae is leaving, they get down in it. Also, the adults, as they're trying to get away from the bees, they'll get down into that oil and they'll drown. But it also serves a third purpose. Those mites that are falling off, where are they going? Down into that oil, and it's killing them off as well. So it can help you with the royal mites as well. If you don't, the only downside of it, of course, is that you've got a lot of oil in that tray. So if you're moving your hive, or like me, if you've got a skunk that comes by every night and starts scratching at the entrance, one of the things I found out last year was that she can reach up there and pull the tray out, and that opens as a little protective grid that goes over top of it, and pulling it out, it exposes it to the bees, and so the bees got down into the oil, and I lost a lot of bees doing that. So one of the things I looked at was just the kitchen wipes. Taking a kitchen wipe, going up into the supers, not the brood frames, but the super frames away from the brood and laying it across the top bars, anchoring it in between the boxes. The bees come up, they start fraying at the cloth, trying to get it out. It causes little locations where the spines of the legs and so forth of the beetle get hung up in there, so you can catch a lot of adult beetles that way. Bees will come up and propolis on it. That even enhances the beetles getting stuck in it. So 20 cents, you've got something, you leave it in there for a week, 2 weeks at most, pull it out, and then you can put another one in. If you leave it any longer, the bees will start to stick to it. So you do want to be careful how long you use this in the hive. But again, those bottom board traps are the ones that I recommend as far as being the best control. If you're a commercial beekeeper moving hives, it's not something you can use though.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Why did you say to me not to use those handy wipes so long? What did you say?
The bees, the worker bees will get stuck in.
Oh, the bees themselves will get
The bees
stuck
themselves
in.
will get stuck in because it becomes so propylized and torn up and so forth that they can get hung up in it as well. Light attraction, opposite of the moths, the beetles like light. So you can set up a light trap inside of your honey house or inside your home, wherever you're storing your supers and so forth. That should attract them in there. And then lastly, nematodes. There's nematodes that are being produced that you can treat the soil around your hive. As the beetles' larvae come out to pupate in the soil, they get infected with the nematodes, which will help to kill them off. They won't complete pupation. These are something that's very easy to raise. Again, local beekeeper or a local beekeeping association can get into the process of raising nematodes and distribute it around to the other beekeepers in the area. The other thing is, you know what you use to raise the nematodes with? Wax moth larvae. So, you want some work out some frustration on wax moths? Raise the nematodes. Yes, ma'am.
What about diatomaceous earth around your, to get them
Diatomaceous
in
earth
the
hasn't-
larvae phase?
Yeah, it hasn't been seen to be that effective.
Okay.
Whether it's not enough concentration or the beetles are just too. Some people thought the sticky board that we used with the mites would work as well. They just laughed at that and just walked across it. But let me end with this thought. Remember I told you about the trachomite and the varroa mite when we went over to Europe? That they told us, hey, you got trachomite, don't worry about those. Wait till you get the varroa mite. We did the same thing with the small hive beetle. We sent researchers over to South Africa to work with the beekeepers and the researchers there. There was one paper written about small hive beetles in South Africa, the origin of the small hive beetle in North America. One paper written back in the late 1950s. That was it. It was such a minor problem for them, they didn't worry about it. What they told us was, small hive beetle? Don't worry about small hive beetle. Wait till you get the large hive beetle. There's worse out there. Okay? And that's one of the things we want to keep out is all these other pests. So we're doing some surveys, finding out what we have, what we don't have, and hopefully we can go to other countries that have things like the small or the large hive beetle or the Tropicolaps mite and tell them, say, yeah, we know you want to come into the country to take advantage of some of that pollination and sell your bees over here, but you've got a pest we don't have, and so we don't want your bees. Okay, any questions? Yes?
So do you have a forum or a blog that we can get more information, like a local?
There's lots of forums and blogs.
No, maybe like the Virginia one?
For Virginia, there's two ways you can get it. There's a Virginia State Beekeepers Association has a Facebook page. They basically have a forum. We have a email address dedicated to the honeybees and beekeeping. It's called Virginia Bees, or VABEES. And it's at vdacs.virginia.gov. If you look at your handout, you can see my email address. If you take off the Keith Tignor, you can put in VABEES instead, and it'll come. It actually comes to me. So either address is fine. But the local associations, as well as the state associations, there's the national associations, there's the Eastern Apiculture Society, there's the American Beekeeping Federation. There's also a group called the Mid-Atlantic Apiculture Research Extension Consortium.
Wait, can you say that again?
MAREC.
What?
M-A-A-R-E-C. And that's a group of states that have come together with the researchers, the regulatory, the beekeepers, and they've put together a lot of information. And so there's a website that's being maintained up in the University of Delaware that gives you a lot of information on beekeeping, whether it's starting with bees or the pests and diseases. Gives you lots of pictures of them and so forth that you can do. We also put out a number of publications, a beginning beekeeping handbook, as well as a honeybees, guide to honeybees and their maladies. It's a pocket-sized book that you can get through your local association. You can get it online, a PDF copy, and look at it and see what pictures of the diseases. But the good thing about that book is it not only shows you the bad things that you can see, it shows you what the good things that you should see. So how does a good frame of calf frame look? How does a healthy larva look? What do healthy bees look like? Those are things that are included in that book to give you some contrast in that goal that most people maintain. Yes, sir.
On potatoes and stuff like that, we got a vegetable, I guess a spray called Colorado beet spray. That and liquid 7. This year I didn't use any spray for the garden, but I sprayed it with prickly honeybees. So what do you recommend for that?
Yeah, the question is how do you deal with pesticide, whether you're using it or somebody else is using it? Again, some of the things are look at the label and see, and usually it has a warning on it if it's highly toxic to bees. There's also different locations that you can get a listing of pesticides that are less toxic or minimal toxicity to bees, and those that are highly toxic to bees. So you can stay away from those that are highly toxic. There's information on, like I said before, on when to apply that could minimize the exposure to the bees. But also look at the half-life of it. Look at the residual of it. You know, is it something that will persist on that plant for a while, or is it something that breaks down very rapidly? Something like a carbamate like 7, highly toxic to bees, but it breaks down very rapidly. So you want to be careful when things are in bloom when you're putting using something like 7. But if it's not in bloom, the bees aren't likely to go to it. That may be something that you could consider. Yes, ma'am.
I really wanted to hear what you had to say about Africanized honeybees. Can you just touch on that real quickly?
Do we have time?
We actually are supposed to be out at 8.
Yeah.
Maybe a side conversation?
Yeah, let me, as far as the Africanized honeybees, that is something that we're on the lookout for. It is something that if we're having bees come into the state, of course we're sampling to test for Africanization. We're educating beekeepers about what to look for. They're a highly defensive bee, and it's not so much that it's going to be less productive for you, it's just higher potential of someone else being stung. And there's a number of stinging incidents that have been health concerns in southern states and the Gulf states and so forth. We don't want to see here in Virginia. So we encourage people to stay away from sources of the Africanized bee and look more locally or someone that has, known to raise European honeybees.
Are you going to post this video on YouTube?
Yes.
Yes, we will.
Hopefully soon.
It won't be very edited, but just that you have it for reference.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming. You've got my email if you need